Jon Snow dies on a cold night at Castle Black, 4 knives in his gut and the word brother on the lips of the men who killed him. He dies with the taste of blood in his mouth and the cold of the wall in his bones, and the last thought, not a thought, a sensation, the feeling of falling through ice into darkness, and then nothing, and then everything. He wakes in Winterfell, 14 years old, the morning of the execution at the Whitehill Holdfast, and the world is the same world he left, and he is not the same man who lived in it. The first breath was wrong, not wrong in the way that pain was wrong, sharp, identifiable. Something the body could process and catalogue and file under threat. Wrong in a deeper sense, a foundational sense, the way the ground would be wrong if it suddenly tilted 30 degrees and everything that rested on it, buildings, trees, people, the accumulated architecture of a life, slid sideways into a configuration that was familiar in its parts and impossible in its arrangement. Jon Snow was 14. He was in his bed in Winterfell, in the small chamber off the main corridor of the great keep that had been his since childhood. Not a lord's chamber, not a guest chamber, a bastard's chamber, adequate and unadorned and positioned with the precise social geometry that Winterfell's household maintained, close enough to the family to acknowledge kinship, far enough from the family quarters to acknowledge the other thing. He sat up. The movement was automatic, driven by muscles that were younger than the mind that commanded them, muscles that had not yet been hardened by the wall, not yet been cut by wildling arrows, not yet been frozen and stabbed and killed. His body was a boy's body. His mind was not. The memories were there, all of them, stacked and compressed and pressing against the inside of his skull with a density that made his vision blur and his hands shake and his stomach lurch with the nausea of a consciousness that was too large for its container. Castle Black. The wall. The wildlings. Ygritte. The name hit like a fist, and the face that came with it was so vivid that Jon closed his eyes against it and saw her behind his eyelids, laughing, dying, the arrow in her chest and the blood on her furs, and the words she spoke that he would carry through every life he was given. The Night's Watch. The mutiny. Elisa Thorne's face, blank with duty. Ollie's face, blank with betrayal. The knives. The cold. The dark. And before all of it, the time before the wall, the time he was living in again now, the family he had left. Father, Robb, Arya, Sansa, Bran, Rickon, Lady Catelyn, who hated him with the quiet persistence of a woman who could not forgive a sin he had not committed. Theon, who mocked him with the relentless creativity of a boy trying to establish a hierarchy in which he was not the lowest. The household, the halls, the godswood, the hot springs, the crypts. The crypts. Jon's feet were on the cold stone floor before the thought was fully formed. He dressed, fumbling, his hands shaking, his fine motor control disrupted by the collision between muscle memory that was 14 years old and reflexes that were 20. And he moved through Winterfell's corridors with the desperate, directed stride of a man who had somewhere to be and not enough time to get there. The crypts were beneath the castle, a long, spiraling descent into the granite bedrock. The tombs of the kings of winter and the lords of Winterfell lining the walls in their stone niches, their stone wolves at their feet and their stone swords across their laps. Jon had been here before, both times in the life he was reliving and in the memories of a life that had not happened yet. The air was cold and still and smelled of dust and stone and the faint, mineral dampness that seeped through the rock from the hot springs above. He went to Lyanna's tomb. His aunt, his mother, the woman who had loved Rhaegar Targaryen and died in a tower of blood and roses and the promise that Ned Stark had kept for 14 years. Jon knew this now, not from the visions that Bran had shown him, because Bran had not shown him anything yet, because Bran was 7 years old and climbing walls, but from the fragments of his previous life, the things he had learned and heard and pieced together, the whispers at Castle Black, the questions about his mother that Ned deflected, the conversations he had overheard and half understood, Aemon Targaryen's words about a Targaryen alone in the world. He did not know everything. His memories were the memories of a man who died at 20, stabbed by his brothers, and who had spent most of those 20 years at the wall, far from the political currents of the realm. He knew the broad strokes. Ned would go south. Ned would die. Robb would go to war. Robb would die. The Lannisters would win. The Boltons would take the north. And beyond the wall, the dead were marching. He did not know the details. He did not know who betrayed Ned, only that Ned was arrested and executed. He did not know how Robb died, only that Robb was killed somewhere in the Riverlands. He did not know the specifics of southern politics, because the Night's Watch took no part, and Jon had taken the vows and had paid attention to wildlings and whites, not kings and queens. He stood before Lyanna's statue and pressed his hand against the cold stone and breathed. "I can change it," he said. The words echoed in the crypt and came back to him distorted, the way crypts distorted everything, making the living sound dead and the dead sound alive. "I know what's coming. I can change it." The statue did not answer. Statues rarely did. But the silence was not empty. It was weighted, charged with the presence of the dead and the expectations of the living, and the strange, impossible burden of a boy who carried the knowledge of a man, and the grief of a ghost, and the responsibility of someone who had been given the chance to rewrite a future that had already killed him once. He climbed out of the crypts into a morning that was ordinary and unbearable simultaneously. Grey sky, cold wind, the sounds of Winterfell waking around him with the routine efficiency of a household that had been performing the same morning tasks for generations. Servants crossed the yard carrying water and firewood. The blacksmith's hammer rang from the forge. The guards on the walls stamped their feet against the cold and watched the tree line with the bored attentiveness of men guarding a border that no one had crossed in anger for years. Everything was the same. Everything was different. The difference was Jon, and Jon was the only one who knew it. He found the direwolf pups that afternoon. The memory was precise. The execution of the Night's Watch deserter, the ride home along the King's Road, the dead stag and the dead direwolf and the 6 pups, 5 for the true-born Stark children, and 1 for the bastard, a white runt with red eyes, set apart from its siblings the way Jon was set apart from his. Ghost, the wolf who would become his other half, his silent shadow. The animal whose bond with Jon was deeper than training and closer to the thing that the old stories called warging. Jon rode with the hunting party. He watched the scene unfold, the stag, the direwolf, the pups, and he said the words he had said the first time. The argument for keeping them. The offer of the runt. The script was the same. The performance was different. Because Jon was performing it, and the performance of a man who knows the ending is different from the performance of a boy who does not, in ways that are invisible to everyone except the performer. He took Ghost. The white pup nuzzled into his chest with the blind trust of an animal too young to distinguish between a boy and a man pretending to be one. Jon held the wolf and felt the bond, not the full bond, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first thread of the connection that would grow into the wire that would hold them together through everything that was coming. The other difference was the dragon egg. Jon remembered, dimly, imprecisely, through the fog of memories that belonged to a dead man, that there were dragon eggs in the world. Daenerys Targaryen had hatched 3. The eggs had been petrified, turned to stone by centuries of dormancy, and they had hatched in fire, Drogo's funeral pyre, the fire that consumed a carl and birthed a queen. Fire and blood. The Targaryen words, the Targaryen method. And Jon was a Targaryen. He did not have proof, would not have proof for years, might never have proof in this timeline, but he knew it with the certainty of a man who had stood in the flames at Craster's Keep and not burned, who had felt the wall's magic tug at his blood, who carried the dreams of dragons in a body that ran hotter than any Stark should. The egg was in the crypts. He did not know this with certainty. He suspected it, guessed it, inferred it from the fragments of knowledge that his previous life had given him. Lyanna's tomb had been sealed by Ned Stark, the items interred with her, the blue winter roses, the personal effects, The things a brother buried with a sister had never been catalogued publicly, and there were stories, old stories, about Targaryen eggs, given as gifts, hidden as treasures, placed in cradles. If Rhaegar had given Lyanna an egg, if Lyanna had carried it to the Tower of Joy, if Ned had brought it back with Jon and hidden it in the one place no one would search. Jon returned to the crypts that night, alone, carrying a torch and a chisel, and the desperate hope of a man whose plan depended on an assumption that might be wrong. Lyanna's tomb was stone. The sarcophagus was sealed with mortar that had hardened over 14 years into something nearly as strong as the stone itself. Jon worked the chisel into the seam and struck it with the heel of his hand, and the mortar cracked in chips and fragments that fell to the floor like grey snow. And the work was slow and exhausting, and his hands were bleeding by the time the lid shifted. Inside the sarcophagus, beneath the skeleton of the woman who had been his mother, wrapped in the remnants of a cloak that had once been Targaryen black and red and was now faded to brown and grey, was an egg. It was the size of Jon's 2 fists pressed together. The surface was scaled, not smooth like a chicken's egg, but textured, each scale distinct, overlapping, the pattern spiraling from the narrow end to the broad end in a helix that caught the torchlight and threw it back in colours that shifted as the angle changed. Dark red, then black, then the deep, burning crimson of embers seen through smoke. The egg was cold. It had been cold for 14 years, buried with a dead woman in a stone tomb beneath a castle built on hot springs. Jon held it. The weight was substantial, heavier than stone, denser, as though the thing inside had compressed itself over the centuries and was waiting for something to tell it to expand. He held it and felt nothing. No warmth, no vibration, no magical response, none of the dramatic reactions that the stories promised. Just an egg, just a stone, just a possibility. He wrapped it in his cloak and carried it back to his chamber and placed it beside his bed and stared at it until the candle burned down and the room went dark and the egg disappeared into the shadows and became indistinguishable from every other object in the room. The next morning, he placed it in the fire. Not the kitchen fire, the fire in the forge, where the coals burned hot enough to soften iron, and where the heat was sustained and consistent, and where the blacksmith, Mikan, would not notice an extra object in the forge if the object was placed there at dawn and retrieved at dusk. Jon nestled the egg into the coals and covered it with ash and stepped back and waited. Nothing happened. The egg sat in the fire, and the fire burned around it, and the scales did not change colour, and the shell did not crack, and no dragon emerged. And Jon stood in the empty forge in the grey morning light and felt the first real doubt. The cold, spreading suspicion that his plan was not merely difficult, but impossible. That dragon eggs hatched for Targaryens who believed they were Targaryens, who had fire in their blood and certainty in their hearts, and that Jon, a bastard who suspected his parentage without proof and who had died once and been sent back without instructions, was not enough. He left the egg in the forge. He did not tell anyone. He went about his day, training in the yard with Robb, eating in the hall with the household, absorbing Lady Catelyn's cold glare with the practiced patience of a boy who had borne it for 14 years the first time, and could bear it again, and he waited. 3 days later, the egg cracked. The sound woke Ghost, the white pup, sleeping at the foot of Jon's bed, lifted his head and stared at the door and made no sound. Because Ghost never made sounds, and the silence of the wolf's alarm was more unsettling than any bark or howl. Jon was out of bed and running for the forge before he was fully awake, and the yard was dark and the forge was banked, and the coals were low and orange, and in the centre of the coals, surrounded by ash and ember and the residual heat of 3 days of sustained burning, the egg was splitting. The crack ran along the spiral of the scales, a dark line that widened as Jon watched. The shell separating along the seam that the heat had found, the 2 halves opening like a flower made of stone. Inside, curled in the wreckage of its shell, wet and dark and impossibly small, was a dragon. It was not what Jon expected. The stories described dragons as terrible, vast, winged, fire-breathing engines of destruction that had conquered continents and melted castles and reshaped the political map of the known world. This was not that. This was a creature the size of a cat, its wings folded against its body like damp leather, its eyes red, the same red as ghosts, blinking against the light of the coals that had birthed it. Its scales were dark, black with red undertones, the same coloring as the egg, and its body was fragile, newborn, trembling with the effort of existing outside the shell that had contained it for gods knew how long. The dragon looked at Jon. Jon looked at the dragon. The moment lasted long enough for Jon to understand that the moment was permanent, that the bond forming between them was not a choice, but a fact. The way gravity was a fact. The way the sun rising was a fact. The way the blood in his veins being Targaryen was a fact, whether anyone else knew it or not. The dragon opened its mouth and made a sound, not a roar, not fire, but a small, creaking chirp. The vocal equivalent of a door hinge that had not been used in a very long time. Then it climbed out of the shell and crawled up Jon's arm and settled on his shoulder and wrapped its tail around his neck. And the tail was warm, hotter than skin, hotter than the forge, the internal furnace of a dragon operating at the scale of a newborn. And Jon stood in the forge with a dragon on his shoulder and a direwolf at his feet, and the knowledge that his life, which had already been impossible, had just become something else entirely. He named it Winterflame. Not immediately. The name came later, after 3 days of consideration and the rejection of every Valyrian name he could remember. Because Valyrian names belonged to Targaryen dragons, and Jon was a Stark as much as he was a Targaryen, and the dragon that hatched in a northern forge deserved a northern name. Winterflame, the fire that burned in the cold. The contradiction that was also a truth. The secret in the walls, hiding a dragon in Winterfell, was easier than Jon expected, and harder than he wanted. The ease came from the dragon's size. Winterflame was small, cat-sized at hatching, growing to the size of a large dog within 3 weeks. The growth rate rapid, but not the exponential explosion that the stories described. Balerion the Black Dread had taken decades to reach the size that melted Harrenhal. Vega had been a century old before she was large enough to carry a knight in full armor. Dragons grew throughout their lives, and the growth was slow enough in the early months to keep Winterflame concealed, in Jon's chamber, in the hot springs beneath the castle, in the ruined sections of the first keep where no one went, because the walls were crumbling and the floors were unreliable and the place had been abandoned for decades. The difficulty came from feeding. Dragons ate meat. Dragons ate a lot of meat, and the quantity increased with the dragon's size, and the increase was not linear but accelerating, each week requiring more than the last, the demand climbing faster than Jon's ability to supply it without attracting notice. He hunted. He took Ghost into the wolfswood and brought back rabbits and squirrels and the occasional deer, and the hunting was useful because 14-year-old boys hunted. It was expected, normal, the kind of activity that drew no questions from the household. But the quantity drew questions from the only person whose attention Jon could not deflect. Arya found out in the 3rd week. She was 9, small, fierce, dark-haired, carrying the Stark coloring that Sansa lacked and the Stark temperament that Sansa rejected. Arya was Jon's closest sibling, had been, would be, was, and her discovery was not an accident but an inevitability, because Arya paid attention to Jon in ways that the rest of the household did not, and attention, sustained over weeks, detected patterns that casual observation missed. "You're feeding something," Arya said. She appeared in the doorway of the ruined tower in the first keep, the building Jon had been using as Winterflame's daytime shelter, and her voice carried the flat certainty of a girl who had assembled evidence and drawn a conclusion and was now presenting the conclusion as a fact rather than a question. "Arya, you've been hunting every day. You bring back game. You don't bring it to the kitchens. Ghost doesn't eat that much. You're feeding something inside the old tower, and I want to see it. You can't. I can. I followed you. I've been following you for 3 days. I know you come here. I know you bring meat, and I know there's something in there that's eating it. Show me, or I'll find it myself." Jon looked at his sister. The girl in front of him was 9 years old, and the woman she would become, Arya Stark, the girl who survived King's Landing and Harrenhal and Braavos and the Faceless Men and the Army of the Dead, was already visible in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. Refusing her was possible. Keeping the refusal was not. You cannot tell anyone. I won't. Arya, this is serious. If anyone finds out, anyone, father included, it could destroy our family. I said I won't tell. I don't break promises. Jon led her into the tower. Winterfell was in the upper chamber, the room where the dragon spent the daylight hours, curled in the warm corner where the heat from the hot springs rose through the cracked floor and created a microclimate that the dragon found comfortable. The beast was the size of a large hound now, its wings folded, its scales dark in the dim light, its red eyes tracking the newcomer with the alert, predatory assessment that was a dragon's default response to unfamiliar presences. Arya stopped. Her breath stopped. Her feet stopped. Everything about her stopped for 3 full seconds. An eternity for a girl who had never been still for 3 consecutive seconds in her life. That's a dragon. Yes, that's a real dragon. Yes, Jon. The word came out in a whisper that was half terror and half the most intense joy that Jon had ever heard in a human voice. Where did you get a dragon? I hatched it. From an egg. I found the egg in the crypts. I'll explain later. Arya, look at me. No one can know. Do you understand? Dragons are not pets. Dragons are weapons. If Robert Baratheon learns that a dragon exists, anywhere, in anyone's possession, he will come for it, and he will come for whoever hatched it, and he will kill them. Robert hates Targaryens. He hates everything connected to Targaryens. And a dragon egg hatching in Winterfell would mean that someone in Winterfell has Targaryen blood, and that someone is me. Arya processed this. The processing took approximately 4 seconds. Fast, even for Arya. And the result was not the question Jon expected. You're a Targaryen? I think I am. I think my mother was Lyanna Stark, father's sister, and my father was Rhaegar Targaryen. I think father took me from the Tower of Joy when Lyanna died and raised me as his bastard to protect me from Robert. How do you know this? Jon hesitated. The truth, I died and came back, and I remember my future life, and I know things that haven't happened yet, was too dangerous and too insane, and too likely to make Arya think he had lost his mind. He needed a partial truth. A truth that explained enough without explaining everything. The egg was in Lyanna's tomb, hidden beneath her bones. Targaryen eggs don't hatch for strangers. Arya, they hatch for Targaryens. The egg hatched for me. Arya looked at the dragon. The dragon looked at Arya. The exchange lasted long enough for Winterfell to make a decision. The dragon uncurled, stretched, walked across the floor with the rolling, lizard-like gait that young dragons used before their coordination matured, and pressed its head against Arya's hand. It's warm, Arya said. The joy was back, irrepressible, 9-year-old joy. The joy of a girl who had prayed for wolves and received a dragon. It's so warm. Don't tell anyone. I won't. I already said I won't. She was scratching behind the dragon's jaw, and the dragon was making the creaking sound that Jon had learned was contentment, the sound of a forge cooling, metal contracting, the miniature version of the sound that fully grown dragons made when they were pleased. What's its name? Winterfell. Arya smiled. The smile was the first genuine smile Jon had seen since waking in this new old life, and the sight of it, familiar, beloved, belonging to a sister he had thought he would never see again, fractured the armor of purpose and urgency that he had been building around himself since the crypt. He had an ally. He had his sister. He had a dragon. Now he needed a plan. The king's arrival. Robert Baratheon arrived at Winterfell with the royal court, the Lannisters, and the offer that would kill Ned Stark. Jon watched from the battlements. He watched the column approach, the wheelhouse, the banners, the Kingsguard in their white cloaks, the Lannister soldiers in their crimson, the fat king on his horse with the crown that seemed too small for his head and the belly that seemed too large for his horse. He watched, and he remembered. And the remembering was not the clean, organized recall of a historian reviewing records, but the jagged, emotional recall of a man reliving the beginning of a catastrophe that had consumed everyone he loved. Robert would ask Ned to be Hand of the King. Ned would accept. Ned would go south. Ned would discover the truth about Cersei's children. Ned would die. Unless Jon stopped it. The problem was how. Jon's knowledge of southern politics was limited. He had been at the Wall during Ned's time in King's Landing, receiving news in fragments and delays, and the fragments he remembered were incomplete. He knew that Ned was arrested. He knew that Ned was executed. He knew that the arrest involved the Lannisters and Cersei and the Iron Throne. And he knew that Ned's honor, his refusal to compromise, his insistence on doing the right thing regardless of the consequences, was the instrument of his destruction. But the details, who betrayed Ned, how the arrest was arranged, what specifically triggered the execution, were beyond Jon's knowledge. He had been a recruit at Castle Black, a boy of 15, receiving news weeks after it happened from ravens that carried official versions rather than true ones. He could not prevent what he did not understand. He could only try to alter the conditions. Don't go south. Jon said it to Ned on the second night of Robert's visit, in the Godswood, beneath the heart tree whose red leaves rustled in a wind that touched nothing else. The request was presumptuous, a bastard telling his Lord Father how to conduct his affairs. But Jon had spent a previous lifetime learning that presumption was sometimes the only alternative to catastrophe. Ned looked at him. The look was the look that Jon had received 1,000 times in his first life. Patient, careful, assessing. The look of a man who loved his bastard son and did not know how to express the love without complicating the lie that the love was built on. Robert is my friend, Jon. He has asked for my help. Robert is the king. Kings don't have friends. They have allies and enemies and people who haven't decided yet. Where did you learn that? Nowhere that Jon could explain. He had learned it at the Wall, from Maester Aemon, from the old Targaryen, who had spent a lifetime watching kings from a distance, and who had understood the machinery of power better than anyone who operated it. But Maester Aemon's lessons were years away and miles north, and Jon could not cite a source that did not yet exist. I've been reading, Jon said. You've been reading. Ned's voice carried the faint amusement of a father who found his son's precociousness endearing rather than convincing. What have you been reading? History. The Targaryens. The hands of the king who went south and didn't come back. Jon Arryn died in King's Landing. The hand before him died in King's Landing. The position kills people. Father, Jon Arryn was old and sick. Jon Arryn was investigating something, wasn't he? Something about the Queen? The shift in Ned's expression was subtle but total. The amusement vanished, replaced by something harder, something alert. The face of a man who had just heard his 14-year-old son say something that a 14-year-old should not know, and that implied access to information that should not be accessible. Who told you that? No one. I inferred it. Lord Arryn died suddenly. The king needs a new hand. He's riding north to Winterfell, a month's ride, instead of appointing someone in King's Landing, which means he either trusts no one in the capital or he's frightened of someone in the capital. And the Lannisters are here. The Queen is here. If Lord Arryn was investigating the Queen when he died, and the king doesn't trust anyone near the Queen's family, Jon, stop. The command was quiet and absolute. Ned Stark did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But the command carried the weight of a man who had gone very still, and whose stillness was not calm, but coiled. You are a clever boy. Cleverer than I gave you credit for. But clever boys who talk about the Queen's secrets in castles full of the Queen's soldiers do not live to become clever men. Do you understand? I understand. That's why I'm talking to you. Here, where no one can hear us. Ned looked at the heart tree. The carved face looked back, eyeless, mouthless, the expression of a god who observed without intervening and judged without speaking. The Godswood was the only private place in Winterfell, the one space where conversations could happen without ears in the walls or servants in the corridors or the casual eavesdropping that was the default social mode of any large household. I am going south, Ned said. I have accepted Robert's offer. The decision is made. Then, be careful. Trust no one in King's Landing, not Baelish, Petter Baelish, the Master of Coin, not Varys, not any of the small council. They all have their own purposes, and none of those purposes include keeping you alive. You know the names of the small council? I told you. I've been reading. The conversation ended without resolution. Ned went south. Jon could not prevent it. The decision was made. The king was waiting, and a 14-year-old bastard did not overrule a Lord Paramount's political commitments, however much the bastard knew about the consequences. But Jon had planted a seed. He had told Ned to distrust Baelish. He had warned about the Queen. He had injected a grain of suspicion into Ned's northern honor, and whether the grain would grow into caution or be crushed by the weight of Ned's principles was a question that only time and King's Landing could answer. Jon did not go to the Wall. In his first life, he had ridden north with Tyrion Lannister and Jon Stark, had taken the Black, had sworn the vows, had given up his name and his family and his claim to anything in the world beyond the Wall and the Brotherhood of the Night's Watch. He had done it because he was a bastard with no prospects, and because Benjen made it sound like honor, and because the Wall was the only place where Jon Snow could be something other than Ned Stark's shame. In this life, he stayed. He stayed because leaving Winterfell meant leaving the dragon, and leaving the dragon meant losing the only advantage he had. He stayed because going to the Wall meant repeating a life he had already lived, and the repetition would consume years that he could not afford to spend on an institution that would eventually betray him. He stayed because the war was coming, and the war required preparation, and preparation required presence. Benjen asked, the disappointment on his uncle's face, the face of a man who had expected his nephew's company on the ride north and was now being denied it, was genuine and painful, and Jon absorbed the disappointment with the guilty knowledge of a man who was making the right decision for reasons he could not share. I thought you wanted to take the Black, Benjen said. They were in the yard, Benjen's horse saddled and his escort waiting, the morning cold and grey, and carrying the flat bleakness of northern goodbyes. I did. I changed my mind. What changed it? Everything. Nothing that Jon could explain. I want to stay with the family. Benjen studied him. The Night's Watch recruiter's instinct, the instinct that evaluated men for their suitability to serve, ran beneath the uncle's affection, and the evaluation produced a result that surprised Benjen. The boy in front of him was different from the boy who had begged to go north a week ago. The difference was not in the face, or the body, or the voice, but in the eyes, which held a depth that 14-year-old eyes should not contain, and a resolve that 20-year-old eyes rarely achieved. The Wall will still be there if you change your mind again, Benjen said. I know. Be careful, uncle. The ranging. Whatever you find beyond the Wall, be careful. Benjen rode north. Jon watched him go and felt the grief of a man who knew that his uncle would disappear beyond the Wall and would not return. And the grief was old and familiar and carried the cold weight of a loss that could not be prevented, because preventing it would require knowledge that Jon did not have, and resources that Jon could not deploy. He turned from the gate. Ghost was at his side. Winterflame was in the old tower, growing, eating, waiting. The family was fracturing. Ned going south with Sansa and Arya, Robb and Bran and Rickon staying north, the household splitting along the fault line that Robert's visit had created. Jon stayed. He trained. He waited. He fed his dragon, and he plotted his moves, and he prepared for the war that was coming. The war that had killed everyone he loved the first time, and that he intended to survive the second. Winterflame grew. The growth was faster than Jon expected, faster than the histories described, faster than the measured, decades-long expansion that the great Targaryen dragons had undergone. By the end of the first month, Winterflame was the size of a pony. By the end of the second, the dragon was the size of a horse, its wings spanning 12 feet when extended, its body too large for the chamber in the old tower and requiring relocation to the hot springs beneath the castle, where the volcanic warmth and the cavern's size provided the space and temperature that the dragon needed. Jon did not know why the growth was accelerated. He suspected the hot springs, the volcanic heat beneath Winterfell, the geothermal energy that the Starks had used for 8,000 years to warm their walls and heat their water. The springs provided a constant source of warmth that mimicked the volcanic environments where dragons had evolved in old Valyria, and the proximity to that warmth seemed to feed Winterflame's growth in ways that open air and surface temperatures did not. The feeding problem became critical. A horse-sized dragon ate the equivalent of a deer per day. Jon could not hunt a deer per day without drawing attention. He expanded his hunting range, recruited Arya to help, and supplemented with sheep purchased from a crofter 3 miles west of Winterfell with coins Jon had saved from his household allowance. The crofter, a taciturn man named Jory Long, no relation to Jory Castle, accepted the coins without question. Bastard lords' sons buying sheep was unusual but not suspicious. Boys did strange things. As long as the coins were good and the purchases were not illegal, Jory Long's curiosity extended no further than the transaction. The concealment was becoming untenable. Winterflame was growing too fast, eating too much and producing evidence, scorch marks on stone, the smell of sulfur in the lower chambers, the occasional sound that rose through the castle's foundations like thunder heard through water that would eventually be noticed by someone whose discretion was not guaranteed. Robb noticed first. Not the dragon, the behavior. Robb was Jon's brother, his closest companion, his mirror and his rival. And Robb paid attention to Jon's routines with the automatic precision of a sibling who had grown up sharing every meal, every training session, and every moment of the life that Winterfell contained. When Jon's routines changed, when the hunting increased, when the absences lengthened, when the time spent in the old sections of the castle grew from occasional to daily, Robb noticed. "You're hiding something," Robb said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement, delivered with the directness that was the Stark family's primary communication style. They were in the training yard, wooden swords in hand, breathing hard from a sparring session that Jon had won. Because Jon was fighting with the muscle memory of a man who had trained at Castle Black, with real steel against men who wanted to hurt him. And the advantage of that experience over Robb's excellent but sheltered technique was unfair in ways that Robb could feel but not explain. "I'm not. You are. You've been different since, I don't know when. Weeks. You fight differently. You talk differently. You disappear for hours and come back smelling like smoke and hot stone and something else, something I can't place. And Arya is covering for you, which means whatever it is, it's either harmless enough that a 9-year-old can keep the secret or dangerous enough that you need a 9-year-old to help you with it." Jon looked at his brother. The young lord of Winterfell, because that was what Robb was now, with Ned in the south and Catelyn with him. Robb was the acting lord at 15, looked back with the expression of a man who loved his brother and did not intend to be lied to. "There's something I need to show you," Jon said. "But if I show you, it changes everything, and it can never be spoken of outside the family. When have I ever betrayed your trust? Never, in either life." Robb Stark had never betrayed Jon's trust, and the solidity of that record, unbroken across 2 timelines, was the foundation on which Jon made the decision that would bring his brother into the most dangerous secret in Westeros. They went to the hot springs, down the stone stairs that led beneath the castle, through the passages that were hot and damp and smelled of mineral water and ancient stone, into the cavern where the springs surfaced in pools of steaming water that the castle had tapped for heating since the age of the first men. Winterflame was in the largest pool. The dragon had discovered that the hot water was more comfortable than the stone floor, and the beast lay in the shallows with its wings spread across the surface and its head resting on the stone rim and its red eyes half closed in the reptilian version of contentment. The dragon was larger than a destrier now, its body 15 feet from nose to tail, its wings spanning 20 feet. Its scales dark and glossy, and reflecting the torchlight in shades of crimson and black that shifted as the dragon breathed. Robb stopped walking. His hand went to his sword, not to draw but to grip, the reflex of a man confronting something that his training had not prepared him for, and whose instinctive response was to touch the weapon that his training had provided. "Jon, Yes, that's a dragon. Yes, there's a dragon in Winterfell. Yes, how? I hatched it. From an egg I found in the crypt. Lyanna's tomb." Rob's mouth opened. Rob's mouth closed. The sequence repeated twice before coherent speech emerged, and the speech, when it came, was not the question Jon expected. "Does father know?" "No, no one knows except Arya. And now you." "Arya knows?" "Arya has known about this. For how long?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My 9-year-old sister has known about a dragon living under our castle for 3 weeks, and no one told me. I'm telling you now. You're telling me now because the thing is the size of a horse, and you can't hide it anymore. Jon did not deny this. The assessment was accurate, and denying accurate assessments was a waste of time that he could not afford. "There's more," Jon said. "I think I'm a Targaryen. I think Lyanna Stark was my mother, and Rhaegar Targaryen was my father. I think father, Ned, took me from the Tower of Joy when Lyanna died, and raised me as his bastard to protect me from Robert." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the rearrangement of everything Rob had assumed about his family, his brother, his father, and the history that connected them. Full of the implications that cascaded from the revelation like stones from a broken wall, each one hitting the ground with a separate impact, and each impact triggering the next. That's why father would never talk about your mother. Yes, that's why he kept you at Winterfell instead of fostering you. That's why he tolerated mother's, her coldness. Because the coldness was the price of the lie. I think so. That's why a dragon egg hatched for you. Because you have dragon blood. Yes, Rob walked to the edge of the pool. Winterflame raised its head, the dragon's eyes fixing on Rob with the steady, unblinking assessment that was a predator evaluating a potential threat. The assessment lasted 3 seconds. Then the dragon lowered its head and returned to its position in the water, the dismissal indicating that Rob had been categorized as harmless. "If Robert finds out," Rob said, "he'll kill you. And then he'll kill father for hiding you. And then he'll burn Winterfell to the foundations. Which is why no one can find out. Not yet. Not until the dragon is large enough to be its own protection, and the political situation changes enough that a living Targaryen is an asset rather than a death sentence." What political situation? Robert is king. The Lannisters control the court. The Targaryens are dead or exiled. What changes? Everything changes. It's going to change soon. And it's going to change badly. I can't explain how I know. Not yet. You wouldn't believe me. But father is in danger in King's Landing, and the Lannisters are going to move against him. And when they do, the realm is going to tear itself apart. Rob looked at Jon. The look was assessment. The same assessment Rob would use on a military situation, evaluating reliability, plausibility. The gap between what was claimed and what was credible. Rob was not a credulous man. But he was standing beside a dragon, and the dragon was incontrovertible evidence that impossible things happened, and the presence of the impossible made the implausible easier to accept. "What do you want to do?" Rob asked. "Prepare, build our strength, train the dragon, be ready for the war that's coming." "And what war is that?" "All of them." "The fall of the hand." Ned Stark was arrested in King's Landing on a hot afternoon in the 9th month of 299 AC. The news arrived at Winterfell by Raven, a scroll bearing the royal seal and the clipped. Bureaucratic language of a court informing a family that their patriarch had been charged with treason and imprisoned in the black cells beneath the Red Keep. The charges were vague, conspiring against the crown, refusing to acknowledge Joffrey Baratheon as the rightful king, attempting to seize the throne in the name of Stannis Baratheon. The language was designed to sound legal. The reality was a coup. Rob received the Raven in the Great Hall. He read it once, and then stood motionless for the span of 10 heartbeats while the household watched and the hall went silent, with the collective instinct of people who recognized bad news from the expression on their lord's face before the news was spoken. "My father has been arrested," Robb said. "The Lannisters hold him in King's Landing." The hall erupted. Maester Luwin asked questions. Theon offered violence. The household staff whispered and cried and did what households did when the lord who held them together was suddenly absent, and the son who replaced him was 15 years old and looked, in that moment, approximately 12. Jon was in the hall. He heard the news and felt two things simultaneously. Grief, because Ned's arrest was the beginning of the end he remembered, and fury, because he had tried to prevent it and had failed, and the failure was his to carry, regardless of whether the prevention was possible. He found Robb afterward, in Ned's solar, sitting behind Ned's desk in Ned's chair, with Ned's sword, Ice, the massive Valyrian steel greatsword, standing in its rack behind him like a grey ghost. "I warned him," Jon said, "before he left. I told him not to trust Baelish. He didn't listen. He's Ned Stark. Listening to warnings about people's trustworthiness is not his strength." The bluntness surprised Robb. Jon, in his first life, had spoken of Ned with reverence. The reverence of a boy who worshipped his father and who had not yet learned that worship and understanding were different skills. Jon in this life had both, and the combination, the love and the clarity, produced observations that were harsher than reverence permitted and truer than worship allowed. "What do we do?" Robb asked. "We call the banners." "For what?" "For war. The Lannisters won't release father willingly. They'll use him as leverage, against us, against the North, against anyone who challenges Joffrey's claim. The only way to get him back is force. Or the credible threat of force, which requires the same preparation. We're calling the Northern Banners to march south against the Iron Throne. We're calling the Northern Banners to march south and demand our Lord's release. What happens after the demand depends on what the Lannisters do." "And the dragon?" Jon paused. The dragon was the variable, the factor that could transform a feudal rebellion into something unprecedented, something that the realm had not seen since Aegon the Conqueror walked off a ship at the mouth of the Black Water with 3 dragons and a vision. But the dragon was also a problem. Winterflame was growing, larger now than any horse, its wingspan reaching 30 feet, but it was still young. Young dragons were not the weapons that old dragons were. Young dragons could be killed by a determined force of archers, could be injured by scorpion bolts, could be overwhelmed by numbers if they were brought to ground. Using Winterflame too early risked losing the dragon entirely. Using Winterflame too late risked losing everything else. "Not yet," Jon said. "The dragon stays hidden until we need it. Until the moment when revealing it changes the outcome rather than the odds. And when is that? I'll know when I see it." The banners were called. The ravens flew north to every holdfast and castle in the realm, Last Hearth, Carhold, the Dreadfort, White Harbour, Bear Island, Deepwood Motte, the mountain clans. The North mobilized with the slow, grinding efficiency of a kingdom that had not fought a war in 15 years, and whose soldiers were farmers and hunters and fishermen who needed to harvest their crops and settle their affairs before they could become soldiers again. The army assembled at Winterfell over 3 weeks. 15,000 men, infantry, cavalry, archers. The martial strength of a kingdom that was large in territory and sparse in population, and that fielded fewer soldiers per mile than any realm in Westeros, except possibly Dorne. The lords came with their retinues, the Greatjon with his umbermen, hard and loud and eager for violence. Lord Karstark with his sons, grim and purposeful and carrying the Karstark determination that was the Stark stubbornness filtered through 300 years of cadet branch independence. Lady Mormont with her Bear Island warriors, women among them, armed and armoured and daring anyone to comment. Roose Bolton with his Dreadfort men. Quiet and disciplined and watched by everyone, because Bolton loyalty was a conditional commodity. Robb was named commander. The title was his by right. He was Ned's heir, the acting Lord of Winterfell, the lord to whom the banners were sworn. But the title was heavier than the boy, and the gap between the authority and the experience was visible to every lord in the camp, and acknowledged by none of them publicly. because acknowledging it would undermine the army before it marched. Jon served as Robb's advisor. Not officially, a bastard had no position in a feudal army's command structure, but practically, in the private councils that Robb held in his tent each evening, where the decisions that shaped the campaign were made by a 15-year-old lord and his 14-year-old bastard brother and a woman called Lady Catelyn, who arrived from the south with a Lannister dwarf as prisoner, and the news that things were worse than they imagined. Catelyn's news was devastating. Ned had been charged with treason. Sansa was a hostage. Arya was missing, vanished from the Red Keep during the arrest, her whereabouts unknown, her fate a blank space in the family's knowledge that was filled with fear and imagination, and the acute torment of not knowing whether a missing child was alive or dead. "Arya is alive," Jon said. He said it to Catelyn in Robb's tent, with a certainty that he could not explain, and that Catelyn, whose relationship with Jon was composed primarily of resentment and discomfort, did not find reassuring. "You cannot know that. I know it." "How? You have been at Winterfell. You have no intelligence from King's Landing beyond the ravens." "I know my sister. Arya is resourceful, and she's fast, and she's harder to kill than anyone expects. She's alive. She escaped." Catelyn looked at him. The look was the one Jon had received for 14 years. Cold, assessing, carrying the residual hostility of a woman who saw in Jon's face the evidence of her husband's infidelity and who could not forgive the evidence. Because forgiving it would mean forgiving the infidelity, and Catelyn Stark did not forgive. But beneath the hostility, beneath the frost, there was something else now. The faintest trace of hope, because a mother who had lost a daughter would accept hope from any source, even a source she despised. The army marched south. 15,000 men, moving down the King's Road toward the Riverlands, toward the Twins, toward the war that would decide whether Ned Stark lived or died, and whether the Stark family survived or shattered. Jon rode with the army. Beneath his cloak, against his chest, he carried a small iron horn, a simple thing, forged by Mikken at Jon's request, unremarkable in appearance, but designed for a single purpose. The horn's sound, at a frequency and pitch that Jon had tested over 3 weeks, was the sound that brought Winterflame. The dragon was not with the army. It was following, at altitude, in the clouds. Visible from the ground only as a shadow that passed over the column and was attributed by the soldiers to an eagle or a trick of the light. The dragon was a weapon. The weapon was hidden. The war was beginning. The crossing. The twins rose from the Green Fork like a pair of rotten teeth in the jaw of the Riverlands. 2 squat, ugly castles joined by a bridge that was the only crossing of the Green Fork for 100 miles in either direction. The castles were functional rather than beautiful, built for commerce rather than grandeur. Their purpose the extraction of tolls from travelers who had no alternative route and whose only options were to pay Lord Warder Frey's price, or to march 100 miles upstream to a ford that might be held by Lannister forces. Jon looked at the twins and felt the cold settle into his stomach, not the cold of the northern wind that pressed against his cloak, but the cold of memory. The cold of a man standing at a location where catastrophe had happened and would happen again if he failed to prevent it. He did not remember the details. The Red Wedding, the name had reached the wall months after the event, carried by ravens and rumor and the horrified whispers of men who had heard third-hand accounts and could not decide whether the stories were true or exaggerated, was a blur of fragments. Robb died at the Twins. At a wedding feast, the phrase turned on him. The Boltons were involved. Guest right was violated. Catelyn died. The Stark army was slaughtered under a roof where they had been promised safety. The fragments were enough. Jon did not need to know the precise sequence of betrayals to know that the Twins was the place where his family had been destroyed, and that the man who owned the bridge, the old lord with the young wives and the countless children and the grievances that he nursed with the devotion other men gave to prayer, was the architect of that destruction. "We cannot promise him a marriage," Jon said. He said it to Robb in the command tent, an hour before Catelyn was scheduled to ride across the bridge and negotiate the crossing. The tent was cramped. Robb, Jon, Theon, the Great Jon, Maester Luwin, and and the air smelled of wet wool and the sweat of men who had been marching for 2 weeks and had not bathed in 3 days. Who said anything about a marriage? Rob asked. He will. Walder Frey has been looking for a way to bind his house to a great family for 50 years. He has daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters, and every one of them is a piece on a trading board. When your mother walks into that hall, Frey will see an opportunity, a desperate army that needs his bridge, and a lord who needs it so badly that he might pay in blood rather than gold. You seem to know a great deal about Walder Frey. I know what everyone in the north knows. He's a toll collector with a title. He charges the maximum and delivers the minimum. Give him gold. Give him trade concessions. Give him a promise to support his grandchildren's claims to some minor holdfast. But do not give him a marriage. Not yours. Not mine. Not anyone in this army whose bond to house Frey would give him leverage over us later. The Gratians snorted. The boy speaks sense. Walder Frey is a weasel in a castle. Pay his toll and cross his bridge, and forget his name. It's not that simple, Catelyn said. She had entered the tent during Jon's speech, her face carrying the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had ridden hard from the south, who had delivered terrible news, who had been separated from her husband and 2 of her daughters, and who was now being lectured on diplomacy by the bastard she had spent 14 years resenting. Walder Frey does not want gold. Gold he has. He wants status. He wants his blood mixed with ours. He has wanted it since before any of you were born. And the only coin that will buy his bridge is the coin he demands. Then we find another way across, Jon said. There is no other way across. Not in time. Not with Jaime Lannister besieging Riverrun and your father rotting in a cell. The silence was functional, not dramatic, not loaded. Merely the silence of men absorbing a tactical reality that did not have a clean solution. The army needed the bridge. The bridge had a price. The price was one that Jon could not pay, because paying it would create the conditions for a massacre that had already happened once in a timeline that only he remembered. Let me go with you, Jon said to Catelyn. To the negotiation. Catelyn's reaction was immediate and predictable. You are a bastard. You have no standing in a negotiation between noble houses. I won't negotiate. I'll observe. I'll stand behind you and say nothing unless spoken to. But I want to see Walder Frey's face when he makes his demands. I want to see what he wants and how badly he wants it. Why? Because I have seen what happens when Walder Frey gets what he wants, and the sight is a hall full of dead Starks, and the sound is a mother screaming, and the smell is blood and betrayal, and the end of the family that I am trying to save. But Jon could not say this. So he said something else. Because I have spent more time studying the politics of crossing lords than anyone in this tent, and I can tell you that Walder Frey's price is never his final price. He asks for the sky because he expects to receive the mountain. If we negotiate correctly, we can give him the foothills, and he'll take them. Robb looked at Catelyn. Catelyn looked at Jon. The hostility was still there. It would always be there, calcified by 14 years of resentment into a permanent feature of their relationship. But it was tempered now by the pragmatism of a woman whose husband was in a dungeon and whose army was stopped at a bridge and whose options were narrowing with every hour that passed. You will not speak, Catelyn said. You will stand behind me. If you open your mouth, I will send you back to the camp. Agreed. They rode across the bridge. Catelyn, Jon, and a small escort, and entered the eastern castle, and Jon looked upon Walder Frey for the first time in this life, and felt the hatred rise like bile. The Lord of the Crossing was ancient. 90 years old, and looking every day of it, a withered, vulture-necked man propped in a chair that was too large for his shrunken body, surrounded by sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters, and the general genetic sprawl of a man who had spent 9 decades fathering children and collecting grudges. His eyes were sharp, though, sharper than his body, sharper than his manners. The eyes of a man who had survived 9 decades by calculating the precise moment to commit to a cause and the precise moment to abandon one. Lady Stark, Frey said. His voice was a croak that somehow conveyed both deference and contempt simultaneously, the vocal equivalent of a bow that didn't quite reach the proper angle. "You honor an old man with your visit. Come to beg, have you? I have come to negotiate Lord Frey's assistance in crossing the Green Fork." Assistance? Yes, that's a pretty word for it. A prettier word than "I need your bridge, and I'll pay whatever you ask because I have no other option." But the meaning's the same, isn't it? The negotiation was a performance. Walder Frey performing the role of the aggrieved lord whose loyalty had been taken for granted by the great houses. Catelyn performing the role of the dignified lady whose desperation was visible beneath her composure. Frey listed his grievances. Catelyn acknowledged them. Frey complained about the Tullys, the Starks, the realm in general, the ingratitude of lords who called their banners and expected the bannermen to bleed without compensation. Then the price. "A marriage," Frey said. His watery eyes moved from Catelyn to Jon, assessing the bastard, cataloguing his potential value, dismissing him, and back to Catelyn. "Your son Rob, my daughter Roslyn. A good match. She's pretty. She's young. She'll give him sons. And the boy there," a gnarled finger pointed at Jon. "He can have one of my granddaughters. He's a bastard, so a granddaughter's appropriate. Don't you think?" Jon's jaw flexed. He said nothing. The effort of silence was physical. A pressure in his throat. A tightening of the muscles that controlled speech. The discipline of a man forcing himself to remain mute while a bridge troll casually bartered the same currency that had purchased a massacre. Catelyn looked at Frey with an expression that was composed and calculating, and, beneath both, furious. The fury of a woman being asked to sell her son's future by a man who had done nothing to earn the right to make the request. "Lord Frey, I cannot promise my son's hand without his consent. He is the Lord of Winterfell's heir, and marriage alliances are matters for Lord Eddard to decide. Lord Eddard is in a cell. Seems to me the boy's making his own decisions now. He decided to call his banners. He decided to march south. He can decide to marry my daughter. My son will marry when and whom Lord Eddard approves. What I can offer is this: a payment of 3,000 gold dragons for the crossing. A commitment to support House Frey's petition for a seat on the Council of the Riverlands once Lord Hoster's lands are secured. 2 of your grandsons fostered at Winterfell, where they will be trained alongside Stark children and afforded every honor. And a promise that House Stark will remember House Frey's loyalty in the war to come, and will repay that loyalty with the same faithfulness." Walder Frey's face underwent a transformation that was slow and ugly. The face of a man whose asking price had been met with a counteroffer that was respectable, but not what he wanted, and whose calculations were now running the mathematics of acceptance versus rejection, leverage versus risk, greed versus prudence. "Gold," Frey said. "Fosterings, promises, very generous. Very generous indeed. But I didn't get to 90 by accepting promises from people who might be dead in a month. Marriage is permanent. Gold runs out. 3,000 gold dragons is a considerable sum, Lord Frey. And fosterings at Winterfell are an honor that most houses in the North would. I know what they are. I know what gold is. I know what promises are. And I know what a Stark marriage is worth. And it's worth more than coins and wards and pretty speeches." Frey leaned forward, and the movement was predatory despite his age, the motion of a man who could smell desperation. "My daughter for your son. Or you swim." The silence stretched, the real kind. The kind that existed because the next words spoken would determine whether an army crossed a river or didn't, and whether a man in a cell in King's Landing had any chance of rescue or none. Catelyn opened her mouth. 5,000 gold dragons, Jon said. Every head in the hall turned. Catelyn's expression was a warning that could have stopped a charging horse. Walder Frey's expression was surprise, the surprise of a man who had been addressed by a piece of furniture. "The bastard speaks," Frey said. "I wasn't aware bastards had opinions in negotiations between noble houses." 5,000 gold dragons, Jon repeated. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had commanded the Night's Watch in another life, and who had learned that authority was a sound before it was a title. Paid in full upon the restoration of Lord Eddard Stark. 2 grandsons fostered at Winterfell. raised alongside Stark children, trained by the master at arms of the North's greatest castle. A written guarantee, sealed by Robb Stark, Lord of Winterfell, that House Frey's loyalty will be recognized in the settlement of the war, including a formal elevation of Lord Frey's standing in the Riverlands Council and preferential trade agreements along the King's Road for a period of 20 years. Frey stared at Jon. The stare was the stare of a man re-evaluating furniture. Who taught the bastard to negotiate? The same person who taught him to count. 5,000 dragons buys a lot of bridges, Lord Frey. And the alternative, refusing passage and watching the North, remember that the Freys sat behind their walls while Lord Stark rotted in a Lannister cell, buys something that gold cannot fix. Is that a threat? It's arithmetic. House Frey has survived for 600 years by choosing the right moment to support the winning side. The Lannisters have arrested the Warden of the North. The Northern Army is at your gate. When this war ends, and wars do end, the side that House Frey chose will be remembered. Support us now, and the reward is substantial and lasting. Refuse us, and the refusal will be remembered with equal permanence. Walder Frey's tongue moved across his lower lip, a reptilian gesture, the motion of a man tasting options. The calculations were visible. The gold was real. The threat was credible. The marriage was not forthcoming, and the alternative, turning away a Northern army and hoping the Lannisters won, was a gamble that a 90-year-old man with 100 descendants could not afford to lose. 5,000 dragons, Frey said. In coin. Not promises. Half upon crossing, half upon Lord Stark's release. 7,000, all upon crossing. 6,000. 3 upon crossing, 3 upon Lord Stark's release. And the fosterings. Frey's eyes narrowed. The old man did not like being negotiated against, and he did not like being negotiated against by a bastard, and he did not like the fact that the bastard was better at it than he expected. But Walder Frey had survived 9 decades by recognizing when a deal was the best deal he would get. And this deal, generous in gold, reasonable in terms, lacking only the marriage that he coveted, was better than the alternative of being remembered as the lord who sealed the North's gate during its darkest hour. Done, Frey said. 6,000 dragons. 3 now, 3 later. 2 grandsons at Winterfell. And if Lord Stark dies in King's Landing, the remaining 3,000 comes from the Stark treasury within the year. Agreed, Jon said, before Catelyn could object. They crossed the bridge. The army flowed through the twins in a column that took 6 hours to pass. Infantry, cavalry, supply wagons, camp followers, and when the last man was across, Jon stood on the western bank and looked back at the castles and felt the relief of a man who had navigated a minefield by memory and emerged on the other side with all his limbs. Catelyn found him. You were told not to speak. I was told that Lord Frey would accept nothing less than a marriage. He accepted gold. Gold we do not have. Gold we will have. When father is free and the war is settled. 6,000 dragons is a manageable debt. A marriage to Walder Frey's daughter is a permanent obligation with consequences that you cannot predict, and that I would not wish on Robb or on the daughter. Catelyn studied him. The hostility was still there, permanent, structural, part of the architecture of their relationship, but it was joined now by something else. Not respect, not warmth, something closer to reassessment, the recalibration of a woman who had categorized the bastard as a problem and was now discovering that the problem had dimensions she had not measured. Where did you learn to speak like that? She asked. Winterfell's library. There is nothing in Winterfell's library about negotiating with Walder Frey. There is everything in Winterfell's library about negotiating with men who want more than they deserve. Catelyn left. Jon watched her go and felt the exhaustion of a man who had been performing a role, competent, confident, authoritative, that his body was too young for and his mind was too old for, and the gap between the two was a space that only he could feel and that no one else could understand. But they were across. The Freys were paid, not promised. The conditions that had produced the Red Wedding, the marriage pact, the obligation, the betrayal of that obligation, were absent. Walder Frey had his gold, and gold, unlike grievances, did not fester. The army marched west toward Riverrun. The plan was Rob's. Jon would give his brother that, would acknowledge, across 2 lifetimes, that Robb Stark was a natural military commander whose instincts for terrain and timing and the movement of men across a battlefield were innate rather than learned. The plan that Robb proposed in the War Council at Hag's Mire was the plan that had worked in Jon's previous life. And the fact that Robb conceived it independently, without the benefit of Jon's foreknowledge, without reference to battles that had not yet been fought, confirmed what Jon had always suspected, that Robb's gifts were genuine, that the young wolf earned his name, and that the waste of those gifts at the Red Wedding was not merely a tragedy, but a strategic catastrophe for anyone who opposed the Lannisters. "We split the army," Robb said. He stood at the map table, a rough oak thing covered with inked parchment and wooden markers representing forces, and his voice carried the calm authority of a boy who had discovered, in the weeks since his father's arrest, that command was a thing he was built for. The foot, 10,000 men, goes south along the King's Road under Lord Bolton. They engage Tywin Lannister's force at the Green Fork, pin him in place, prevent him from reinforcing Jaime. "And the horse?" the Great Jon asked. 5,000 riders go west, through the Whispering Wood to Riverrun. Jaime has divided his forces, half besieging Riverrun from the south bank, half from the north. If we can catch his northern force in the wood, we can destroy it and break the siege. "Jaime Lannister is the best swordsman in the 7 Kingdoms," Lord Karstark said. "Catching him is one thing. Holding him is another. We don't need to outfight him. We need to outthink him. The Whispering Wood is dense. It negates cavalry superiority, limits visibility, turns an open field battle into 100 small engagements where numbers and local knowledge matter more than individual skill. Jaime will charge. Jaime always charges. When he does, we close around him and make the charge into a cage." The plan was good. Jon knew it was good because it had worked. In the life he remembered, Robb had executed this plan and captured Jaime Lannister and broken the siege of Riverrun and established himself as the most dangerous military commander in Westeros. The plan would work again. But Jon had concerns that the plan did not address. "Lord Bolton," Jon said. The name produced a reaction in his gut, the visceral, memory-driven response of a man who knew that Roose Bolton would eventually betray the Starks, that Bolton's son would take Winterfell, that the flayed man banner would fly where the direwolf should have been. "What about him?" Robb asked. "The southern force, the foot, the 10,000, they're not meant to win at the Green Fork. They're meant to delay Tywin, to buy time for the cavalry to reach the Whispering Wood. Lord Bolton will be commanding a force that is designed to take casualties. Someone has to command it. Someone loyal has to command it. Someone who will fight hard enough to pin Tywin, but cautious enough to preserve the men. Bolton is." Jon hesitated. He could not say Bolton is a traitor. He could not explain how he knew that the Lord of the Dreadfort would feed northern soldiers to Tywin's army with the calculated indifference of a man who was already planning his betrayal. He could not share knowledge that was built on memories of events that had not happened. "Bolton is cold. Calculating, he will preserve his own men at the expense of others. The Hornwood men, the small folk levies, they'll bear the brunt while Bolton's Dreadfort soldiers hold back." Robb frowned. "Bolton's father served mine faithfully. Bolton serves Bolton. Give him the command. He's capable, and the other lords will accept it. But assign the Great Jon as second. Someone loud, someone aggressive, someone who will push the attack when Bolton wants to hold back. You want me to second-guess my own commander? I want you to balance his instincts with someone whose instincts are opposite. Bolton is a scalpel. The Great Jon is a hammer. Together, they'll do the job." Robb considered it. The consideration was visible. The young lord weighing counsel against propriety, pragmatism against the feudal structure that expected lords to command and bastards to stand behind them. The weighing lasted 3 breaths. "Done," Bolton commands. The Great Jon goes with him, commanding the reserve. If Bolton orders a retreat, the Great Jon can countermand it. That will anger Bolton. Bolton can be angry when the war is won. The army split at dawn. 10,000-foot soldiers marching south under Bolton's flayed man banner, and the Griotjon's roaring giant, moving toward the Green Fork where Tywin Lannister's host waited with 20,000 men, and the patient, methodical discipline that had made the Lord of Casterly Rock the most feared commander in the realm. 5,000 cavalry riding west under the direwolf, riding fast, riding quiet, moving through terrain that swallowed sound and concealed movement, and transformed an army into a forest. Jon rode with the cavalry. Ghost loped beside his horse, the White Wolf drawing looks from soldiers who had never seen a direwolf, and whose first instinct was fear, and whose second instinct, upon seeing the beast's obedience, was awe. The iron horn hung beneath Jon's cloak, next to his skin, warm from his body heat, and ready for the sound that would bring fire from the sky. He did not plan to use it. The Whispering Wood did not require a dragon. It required discipline, patience, and the willingness to let Jaime Lannister's aggression become his own trap. The dragon was for later. The dragon was for the moment when sword and horse and northern courage were not enough, when the stakes exceeded what men could resolve and required something older and stranger and more terrible. The Whispering Wood earned its name. The trees were ancient, oaks and elms and ironwoods whose canopy was so thick that the light beneath was perpetual twilight. Green and grey, and broken only by the occasional shaft of sun that penetrated the leaves and illuminated a circle of forest floor with the precision of a spotlight. The ground was soft, with centuries of fallen leaves, muffling hooves, swallowing sound, turning the passage of 5,000 horsemen into something closer to whisper than thunder. They reached their positions at nightfall. Robb deployed the forces with an economy of instruction that belied his age. 3,000 men in a crescent along the ridgeline east of Riverrun, positioned to block Jaime's retreat, 2,000 in reserve, hidden in a draw behind the ridge, ready to close the trap when Jaime committed his charge. Grey Wind moved through the trees with the silent lethality of a predator who had found his territory, and the wolf's presence, enormous, pale, yellow-eyed, unsettled the horses of the Lannister scouts who ventured too close, and retreated with reports of something large in the wood that they could not identify. Jaime attacked at dawn. The Kingslayer's instincts were exactly what Robb had predicted. Aggressive, direct, contemptuous of the notion that a boy of 15 could outmaneuver a knight of 33 whose military education had begun at tourneys and whose combat experience spanned the Greyjoy Rebellion and a decade of Kingsguard service. Jaime saw the northern vanguard, perceived it as the main force, and charged. The charge was magnificent. Even Jon, who hated the Lannisters with the accumulated hatred of 2 lifetimes, who carried the memories of Ned's imprisonment and Robb's death and his own murder at the hands of men who served Lannister interests, could not deny the artistry of Jaime Lannister in battle. The Kingslayer fought as a hawk hunted, fluid, precise, beautiful in the way that violence was beautiful when it was executed without hesitation or error. His sword moved through the northern vanguard, and the men who fell before it fell the way trees fell before wind, not because they were weak, but because the force was irresistible. But Jaime charged into a bowl. The ridgeline curved around him. The trees closed behind him. The reserve force, which he had not seen and could not have anticipated, emerged from the draw and sealed the escape route, and the Kingslayer, for all his brilliance, for all his speed and skill and the white cloak that billowed behind him like a battle flag, found himself surrounded. The fighting lasted 2 hours. It was forest combat, chaotic, fragmented, visibility limited to 30 feet. The clash of steel muffled by the canopy, and the cries of the wounded absorbed by the moss and the mud. Jaime fought toward Robb, the Kingslayer recognizing that his only hope was to kill the enemy commander and shatter the northern cohesion. And the fight that resulted was not the elegant single combat of a tourney, but the brutal, exhausting melee of a man fighting through a collapsing position. Jon fought beside Robb. He fought with ice, not the Valyrian greatsword, which was too large for a 14-year-old to wield effectively, but with a castle-forged longsword that Mikken had made for him, and that he wielded with the technique of a man who had trained at Castle Black with blunted steel and lived desperation. Ghost fought beside him, the direwolf killing with the efficiency of an animal whose instincts had been honed by a bond with a warg whose combat awareness extended into the wolf's senses and made the pair of them, boy and wolf, a unit whose coordination was unnatural and whose effectiveness was devastating. Jaime reached Robb. The Kingslayer cut down 2 Karstark men-at-arms and a Mormont soldier and emerged into the clearing where Robb stood with his guard, and the moment the Golden Knight lunging toward the boy lord was the hinge of the battle. Grey Wind took him from the side. Not a kill. Robb's wolf was trained, controlled, and Robb had shouted a command that meant disable rather than destroy. The direwolf's jaws closed on Jaime's sword arm, not the hand, the forearm, and the grip was sufficient to bring the Kingslayer to his knees, and the northern guardsmen were on him before he could rise. And the Golden Lion of Casterly Rock was face down in the mud of the Whispering Wood, with a direwolf's teeth dimpling his armor and a circle of swords pointed at his throat. "Yield," Robb said. Jaime Lannister looked up. His face was bloody, a cut above his eye, a bruise on his jaw, the general rearrangement that combat inflicted on even the most skilled fighters. His golden hair was matted with mud. His white cloak was brown with dirt and red with blood that was not all his own. And his eyes, green, bright, furious, held the expression of a man who could not believe that a boy with a wolf had done what 20 years of combat had failed to produce. "Yield," Robb said again, "or I let my wolf finish what he started." Grey Wind growled. The sound was low and steady and communicated, with the eloquence that only an animal could achieve, that the suggestion was not a threat, but a promise. "I yield," Jaime said. The words were flat, drained of inflection, the verbal equivalent of a flag being lowered. Jaime Lannister was bound, disarmed, and taken to the rear under heavy guard. The Whispering Wood was won. The siege of Riverrun was broken when the southern Lannister force, learning that the northern force had destroyed their counterpart, retreated toward Harrenhal in disorder. Edmure Tully emerged from Riverrun's gates and embraced Robb and called him the young wolf, and meant it as tribute. Jon stood apart from the celebration. Ghost sat beside him, blood on his muzzle, and Jon cleaned it with a cloth and watched the northern army cheer, and felt the complex blend of satisfaction and dread that came from knowing that the battle was won and the war was far from over. In his first life, this victory had been the beginning of a trajectory that ended in crowning and catastrophe. Robb declared king in the north. The war extending beyond rescue into rebellion, the Freys and Boltons plotting, the Red Wedding waiting at the end of the road like a cliff hidden by fog. Jon had altered the path. No marriage pact with Frey, Bolton partially leashed. But alteration was not prevention, and the forces that had destroyed Robb were not limited to 2 treacherous lords and a broken promise. The Raven arrived on the second day after the battle. The message was from Varys, not signed, not sealed, written in a hand that Jon did not recognize, and delivered by a bird that bore no castle's mark. A single sentence, written in the cipher that spymasters used when the message was too dangerous for plain language, but too urgent for subtlety. Robb decoded it with Maester Vyman's help. The color left his face as he read. "Joffrey has ordered father's execution," Robb said. "Public, at the Great Sept of Baelor, in 3 days. Dragonrise? 3 days. The distance from Riverrun to King's Landing was 500 miles by road, 3 weeks' hard march for an army, 2 weeks for a fast rider on a succession of fresh horses, and utterly irrelevant by any mode of travel that touched the ground. The roads were Lannister-held. The riverlands were contested. A rescue force moving south would be detected, engaged, and destroyed long before it reached the capital. But Winterflame did not travel by road. Jon stood at the edge of the camp, at the tree line where the firelight surrendered to darkness, and looked up. The sky was clear, the stars of late autumn burning cold above the riverlands, and somewhere in that darkness, at an altitude where men were specks, and armies were smudges, and the wars of kings were invisible, his dragon was circling. He raised the iron horn to his lips and blew. The sound was low and carrying, not the brassy blast of a war horn, but a deeper tone, resonant, the vibration traveling through the air and the ground simultaneously, audible to human ears as a hum, and to the dragon as a summons. Jon had designed the tone through weeks of trial, testing frequencies against Winterflame's responses, finding the pitch that the dragon associated with Jon the way a dog associated a whistle with a master, and the association was deeper than training, because the bond between dragonrider and dragon was not behavioral but blood, not learned but inherited, woven into the shared Targaryen ancestry that ran through Jon's veins and through the scales that covered the creature that had hatched for him. In a forge fire, Winterflame descended. The dragon's arrival was not subtle. A creature with a 40-foot wingspan and a body that weighed more than a destroyer did not descend from altitude without displacing air, and the displaced air hit the tree line like a storm front, branches cracking, leaves scattering. The campfires in the near section of the army guttering and flaring as the wind from the wings swept across the ground. Soldiers shouted. Horses screamed. The sentries on the nearest picket line dropped their spears and ran. Winterflame landed in the field beyond the tree line with an impact that Jon felt through his boots. The dragon was larger than the last time Jon had seen it at ground level, the growth continuous, relentless. The hot spring heat that had fueled the early expansion now replaced by the dragon's own metabolic furnace. 45 feet from snout to tail, wingspan approaching 50. Scales that were dark as forge iron in the starlight, catching the distant firelight and reflecting it in crimson bands that pulsed along the dragon's flanks with each breath. The eyes, red, constant, lit from within by the same fire that the dragon could project through its jaws, found Jon and held him with the steady, possessive regard of a predator greeting the only human it would not eat. "Easy," Jon said. He walked forward. The dragon's breath was hot, furnace hot, the exhalation carrying a temperature that wilted the grass within 10 feet and that would have blistered human skin at 5. Jon did not blister. The heat enveloped him and felt the way a hearth felt to a man coming in from snow, warm, welcoming. The body's recognition of an environment that was natural rather than hostile. He did not mount. Not yet. He stood beside the dragon and placed his hand on the scales of Winterflame's neck. Hot, hard, the texture of heated metal over muscle, and the dragon turned its massive head and regarded him with one red eye. And the eye held intelligence that was not human, but was not absent. The mind of a creature that understood hierarchy and bonding and the relationship between the man who fed it and the flight that defined its nature. "We need to fly," Jon said. "South, fast. Can you carry me?" The dragon did not answer in words. Dragons did not speak. But Winterflame lowered its neck. The motion slow, deliberate, the posture of an animal inviting a rider. And the invitation was answer enough. The commotion arrived in the form of Robb, who came crashing through the tree line with grey wind at his heels and 24 soldiers behind him, all of them armed and most of them terrified, and none of them prepared for the sight that confronted them. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, standing beside a dragon in a field outside Riverrun, with his hand on the creature's neck and the creature's head lowered in submission. "7 hells," the Great Jon whispered. He had followed Robb because the Great Jon followed combat the way a hound followed blood, and the commotion from the picket line had sounded like combat. But the Great Jon's sword, already drawn, lowered as his brain processed what his eyes reported, and the bravest man in the northern army stood slack-jawed in the starlight and stared at something that had not existed in Westeros for 150 years. "Jon," Robb said. His voice was controlled, the voice of a commander who had learned in the weeks since the war began. That panic was contagious, and calm was currency. The army can see this. Let them see it. There is no more time for hiding. "What are you?" "I'm flying to King's Landing. Tonight, I'm going to save Father." The words landed in the silence between them, the silence of 20 soldiers processing the impossible and 2 brothers facing a decision that would alter the course of a war and possibly a world. "You can't," Robb said. "You've never ridden it. You've never flown. You don't know if it can carry you that distance. You don't know if it will obey you in flight." You don't know what the Lannisters will do when they see a dragon over the capital. I know that father dies in 3 days. I know that no army can reach King's Landing in 3 days. And I know that this can. Jon's hand pressed against Winterflame's scales. This is why I stayed, Rob. This is why I didn't go to the wall. Why I found the egg. Why I hatched it. This is the moment. Everything I've done since I woke up in Winterfell has been for this. Rob looked at the dragon. The dragon looked back. The exchange was brief and one-sided. Winterflame assessed Rob with the indifference of a predator for whom every non-bonded human was equally irrelevant. And then the great head turned back to Jon, and the red eyes held steady, and the message was clear. I am waiting. If you die, Rob said. If you fall from that thing, or the Lannisters kill you, or then you have Jaime. Trade him for Sansa. Make peace with the Lannisters or break them, whichever the banners support. But don't crown yourself king in the north. Stay warden. The crown is a trap. The last sentence carried a weight that Rob could not interpret, and Jon could not explain. The weight of a man who had watched his brother accept a crown that made him a target for every enemy and every ally whose loyalty was contingent on victory, and who had watched that crown become a coffin. Don't crown myself. Promise me. Rob looked at Jon. The look was long, and the things it contained, fear, admiration, love, the bewildered recognition that his bastard brother was something more and something stranger than a bastard, were visible in the firelight that the dragon's body reflected in crimson bands. Be safe, Rob said. The words were inadequate. All words were inadequate for the moment when a brother watched another brother climb onto a dragon and prepare to fly into the capital of a hostile kingdom. Alone, at night, with nothing but fire and blood between him and the army of the most powerful family in Westeros. Jon climbed. The mounting was ungraceful. Winterflame's back was not saddled, not padded, covered in scales that provided grip but not comfort, and the angle of the dragon's body required Jon to pull himself up by ridges of scale and hope that his weight did not shift the creature's balance. He settled into the hollow between the dragon's shoulders, a natural seat. The point where the neck joined the body and the wing muscles created a valley that a rider could sit in without sliding, and gripped the leading edge of the wings where they connected to the shoulders. And the grip was precarious, and the position was terrifying, and the entire exercise was, by any rational assessment, suicidal. Winterflame rose. The ascent was vertical, the dragon launching from the ground with a thrust of its hind legs and a single massive downstroke of wings that generated a wind so powerful it knocked 3 soldiers flat and sent the Grietjon's cloak over his head. The ground dropped away. The camp dropped away. Riverrun dropped away, the castle's torches shrinking to a constellation of orange points, then to a smear, then to nothing. The darkness closed around Jon like a fist, and the only light was the red glow of the dragon's eyes and the stars above, and the distant, scattered fires of the riverlands below, and the cold of altitude, the temperature dropping with every 100 feet of elevation, would have killed a normal man in minutes. Jon did not feel it. The dragon's body radiated heat, the internal furnace that powered the fire pouring warmth through the scales and into Jon's legs and hands and chest. And the warmth was total, encompassing, the way a hot bath surrounded the body, and Jon rode the dragon through the freezing sky and felt warm. The flight was terror and freedom simultaneously. Terror because the height was absolute. Jon could see the ground below as a dark patchwork of fields and forests and rivers reflecting starlight, and the distance between him and that ground was a distance that human bodies were not designed to cross without dying. Freedom because the speed was extraordinary. Winterflame in flight was faster than any horse, any ship, any raven, the dragon's wings eating distance with each stroke, the riverlands scrolling beneath like a map being unrolled by a giant's hand. Jon leaned forward, pressing his body against the dragon's neck, reducing his profile against the wind that tore at his cloak and his hair and his eyes. The wind was brutal. Even in the warm pocket behind the dragon's head, The air movement was violent enough to numb his face and make his eyes stream. He closed them. He did not need to see. Winterflame knew south. The dragon navigated by senses that Jon did not share and could not understand. Senses that were perhaps magnetic, perhaps solar, perhaps something older and stranger. The inherited navigational instinct of a species that had once crossed the skies of Valyria without guidance or goading. They flew through the night. Jon dozed, the exhaustion of weeks catching him now that the decision was made and the action was in progress, and the only thing left was the waiting, and the dozing was fitful, interrupted by the dragon's occasional adjustments, and by the dreams that the altitude and the speed and the proximity to fire produced. Dreams of the Tower of Joy, of Lyanna dying, of Ned picking up a baby and a lie and carrying both north. Dreams of his death at Castle Black, the knives and the cold and the falling. Dreams of the fire that had brought him back, and the fire that was carrying him forward. He woke to dawn. The sun was rising behind them, east, orange, the light spilling across a landscape that was different from the one he had fallen asleep above. The riverlands were behind. The crownlands were below, rolling hills, tilled fields, the network of roads and villages that radiated outward from the capital like spokes from a wheel hub. And ahead, still distant but growing, the skyline of King's Landing. Jon saw the city from above for the first time and understood, with the clarity that altitude provided, why the Targaryens had built their capital here. The city occupied a set of hills at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where the river met the sea, and the natural geography, defensible heights, deep water, convergent roads, made it the inevitable center of any kingdom that unified the continent. The Red Keep sat on the highest hill, Aegon's High Hill, a fortress of red stone and iron gates that dominated the city from the east. The Great Sept of Baelor crowned Visenya's Hill to the west, its crystal dome catching the first light of morning and throwing it back in prismatic fragments that made the building look as though it were made of captured sunlight. Between them, the city spread, 250,000 people in a labyrinth of streets and alleys and squares, and somewhere in that labyrinth, in the black cells beneath the Red Keep, or in the sept where the execution was to take place, Ned Stark was alive for the last time. Jon tightened his grip. Winterflame, sensing the change in tension, adjusted its flight. The dragon descending slightly, its speed increasing, the wings finding a new rhythm that was less cruise and more attack. They were 30 miles out. The city was a smudge on the horizon, growing, resolving, the towers of the Red Keep becoming visible as individual structures rather than a mass. Jon had time. The execution was scheduled for midday, a public spectacle, designed to demonstrate Joffrey's authority and to serve as a warning to anyone who challenged the Lannister hold on the throne. The morning light was young. The hours between now and midday were Jon's margin, and the margin was sufficient. He used the time. He circled high above the clouds, invisible from the ground, and he studied the city from the air, and he planned the approach, and he spoke to Winterflame in the language that was not language. The bond communication that existed between dragonrider and dragon, the exchange of intent and emotion that told the creature what the rider needed without a crude intermediary of words. The plan was simple. Simple plans survived contact with reality. Complex plans did not. Land at the sept. Get Ned. Leave. Everything else was detail. The Sept of Baelor. Eddard Stark was brought to the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor at midday, in chains, in the clothes he had been arrested in, which had been worn for weeks in the black cells and which hung from his frame with the limp exhaustion of fabric that had absorbed too much sweat, and fear, and darkness. He was thinner than Jon remembered, thinner than a man should be after weeks of imprisonment, the flesh falling away from the northern bone structure the way snowmelt revealed the rock beneath. His hair was tangled, and his beard was matted, and his eyes, grey, stark grey, the colour of iron and winter and the north itself, were the eyes of a man who had accepted something that acceptance could not make bearable. Jon saw him from above. 2,000 feet, circling in the cloud layer, looking down through a gap in the cumulus at the steps of the sept where the crowd was gathering, and the stage was being set for an execution that was also a coronation of Joffrey's cruelty. He could see the arrangement, Ned at the center, flanked by gold cloaks, the executioner. Sir Ilyn Payne, the tongueless knight, standing behind with a greatsword that Jon recognized even from altitude, because the sword was ice, Ned's own sword, taken from him and about to be used to take his head. Sansa was there. Jon could see her, a small figure in a grey dress, standing near Cersei and Joffrey on the elevated platform, her posture rigid with the controlled terror of a child who had been told that her father's life depended on her compliance, and who was complying so hard that her body had gone stiff with the effort. Joffrey stood beside her, the boy king's posture conveying the theatrical authority of a child playing at adulthood, his crown catching the light with every movement of his head. The crowd filled the square. Thousands of people, small folk, merchants, beggars, the general population of a city that treated executions as entertainment and political theatre as spectacle. They pressed against the line of gold cloaks that ringed the steps, pushing, craning, shouting. The sound rising to Jon's altitude as a continuous murmur that was the voice of a city watching power perform. Jon saw Arya. His heart lurched, a physical contraction, the recognition arriving before the analysis, and he found her in the crowd, small, dressed in boy's clothes. Her hair cropped short, standing at the base of Baelor's statue with the desperate, helpless expression of a child who was about to watch her father die, and who could do nothing to prevent it. A man stood near her, an older man, heavyset, a hand on her shoulder, and Jon did not recognize him from altitude, but the hand's position was protective, and whatever the man's identity, his purpose was to shield Arya from the worst of what was coming. Joffrey spoke. Jon could not hear the words from altitude, but he could see the gestures, the boy king raising his arms, addressing the crowd with the performative grandiosity of a 13-year-old who had been given absolute power and was using it the way a child used a new toy, recklessly, proudly, with no understanding of the consequences. Then, Ned was pushed forward. The gold cloaks forced him to his knees. Ilyn Payne raised ice, the massive blade catching the sun and throwing a reflected line of light across the crowd, and the crowd noise shifted from murmur to roar, the sound of thousands of people reacting to the imminence of death with the complex human mixture of horror and excitement, and the terrible, magnetic fascination that violence exerted on the species that had perfected it. Jon dove. The descent was not gradual. Winterflame folded its wings and dropped, a controlled plummet, the dragon's body streamlined, the speed doubling, tripling, the wind screaming past Jon's face with a sound that was not wind, but something older and more fundamental, the sound of the sky being torn by a creature that was not subject to the rules that governed earthbound things. The altitude melted, 2,000 feet to 1,000, 1,000 to 500, 500 to 200, and at 200 feet, when Jon could see the individual faces of the people below and could read the expression on Ned's face, Winterflame opened its wings. The dragon's shadow crossed the square. The shadow was enormous, a dark shape sweeping across the crowd like a cloud. But clouds did not have wings, and clouds did not move at 60 miles an hour, and clouds did not produce the sound that Winterflame produced when its wings caught the air and the deceleration generated a thunderclap that shattered every window on the ground floor of the buildings surrounding the square. The crowd saw the dragon. The reaction was instantaneous and total, 250,000 years of evolutionary programming, the deep lizard brain recognition that a large flying predator was directly above, overrode every social convention and every civic obligation and every human pretension to rationality. People screamed. People ran. People fell and were trampled by people who were running and who did not stop to help them because the imperative to flee from a predator was older than compassion and stronger than morality. Winterflame landed on the steps of the great sept of Baelor. The impact cracked the marble. The dragon's weight, several tons, distributed across 4 clawed feet, compressed the stone steps and left impressions that would remain for decades. The physical evidence that a creature of fire and scale had stood where the faith had built its greatest monument to the gods who were supposed to govern the world. Jon dismounted. The movement was fluid. He had learned the mounting and dismounting during the flight, the way a swimmer learns a stroke during a crossing, the technique emerging from necessity and the body's adaptation to the dragon's geometry. He landed on the cracked marble, drew his sword, and stood between Winterflame and the tableau of execution that the dragon's arrival had frozen mid-act. Ilyn Payne stood with ice raised, the executioner's face, tongueless, expressionless, the professional mask of a man who killed for the crown, was unchanged, because Ilyn Payne did not express emotion and did not process surprise the way other men processed it. But his arms had stopped. The sword had stopped. The execution had stopped, because even a man without a tongue understood that completing a beheading while a dragon stood 10 feet away was not a survivable decision. Joffrey was screaming. The boy king's composure, such as it existed, which was minimal, had shattered at the moment the shadow crossed the square, and Joffrey was now producing a sound that was equal parts terror and outrage, the sound of a child who had been promised the world and was now confronting the thing that had ruled the world before children existed. Cersei had grabbed her son and was pulling him backward, away from the dragon, her face a mask of controlled panic that was controlling nothing. The Kingsguard had drawn swords, 5 white-cloaked knights. The Hound not among them, Jaime not among them. The remnant force that guarded a king who had just lost the authority that the swords were supposed to enforce, formed a line between the royal platform and the dragon, and the line was brave and useless, and they knew it, because no amount of training prepared a knight for the thing that was standing on the steps of the sept, and whose breath was heating the marble to the point where the stone was beginning to discolor. Jon did not look at Joffrey. He did not look at Cersei. He did not look at the Kingsguard, or the gold cloaks, or the fleeing crowd. He looked at Ned. His father, the man who had raised him, who had lied for him, who had carried the secret of his birth through 14 years and a war and a marriage and the daily corrosion of his wife's contempt, was on his knees on the steps, in chains, staring at the dragon with the expression of a man who had accepted death and was now being confronted with something that was not death but might be worse. Because death was comprehensible and a dragon was not. "Father," Jon said. Ned's eyes moved from the dragon to the boy. The recognition was slow, Ned's mind processing through the fog of weeks of imprisonment, malnutrition, dehydration, and the trauma of preparing to die, but when it arrived, the recognition carried everything. Confusion, relief, terror, love, and the staggering incomprehension of a man who could not construct a causal chain between his bastard son and the creature that was currently melting the steps of the holiest building in the capital. "Jon, we're leaving." Jon stepped forward. His sword was in his hand, not a threat to anyone present, because the threat was behind him and weighed several tons, but a tool for the immediate task, which was cutting the chains on Ned's wrists. The castle forged steel bit into the iron links and did not cut them. Castle steel was not Valyrian steel, and iron chains were not rope. And Jon swore and struck again, harder, and the chain link deformed, but did not break. Winterflame solved the problem. The dragon lowered its head, the massive skull passing over Jon's shoulder, the heat from the nostrils making Jon's hair stand on end, and breathed on the chains. Not fire, not the full, incinerating blast that could melt steel and stone, but heat, focused heat, the controlled application of the internal furnace to a narrow point. The iron chains glowed orange, then white, then sagged and broke, the metal falling away from Ned's wrists in drops of molten iron that hissed on the marble. Ned's hands were free. The skin beneath the chains was raw and red and would scar, but the hands were free, and Jon gripped his father's arm and hauled him to his feet with a strength that surprised both of them. "Can you walk?" "Jon, what, how, later? Can you walk?" Ned could walk, barely. The weeks in the black cells had weakened him, and the joints that had been cramped in chains were stiff and painful. But he could walk, and Jon guided him toward the dragon with the urgent care of a son who was rescuing his father, and whose window for rescue was measured in the seconds before the Lannister response organized itself from shock into action. Sansa, Jon saw her on the platform. She had not moved, frozen, the way animals froze before predators, the stillness of a creature whose survival instinct had chosen invisibility over flight. She was staring at the dragon with wide blue eyes, and her face was white, and her hands were gripping the rail of the platform with a force that had turned her knuckles into bone. He could reach her. The platform was 40 feet away. Winterflame's bulk blocked the Kingsguard's approach from the right. The crowd had fled, opening a clear path. Jon could reach Sansa in 10 seconds, pull her free, get her to the dragon. A crossbow bolt struck the marble 3 feet from Jon's left boot. The gold cloaks on the far side of the square, the ones who had not fled, the disciplined remnant, a dozen men with crossbows who had found positions behind the stone barriers, and who were now doing the thing that disciplined men did when confronted with the impossible. They were shooting at it. A second bolt hit Winterflame's flank. The dragon screamed, a sound that was not pain but fury, the sound of a creature whose response to attack was not retreat but annihilation. And Winterflame's head swung toward the crossbowman, and the furnace opened. The dragonfire hit the stone barrier that the gold cloaks were sheltering behind, and the stone exploded, not burned, not melted, exploded, the thermal shock shattering the granite the way a hammer shattered glass, and the gold cloaks behind the barrier scattered, 2 of them on fire, the rest running. More bolts. From the other direction, from the steps of a building on the far side of the square. One struck Winterflame's wing membrane, a thin section, vulnerable, the leathery tissue between the wing bones that was the only soft target on a dragon's body. And the dragon shrieked and turned, and Jon felt the vibration through the marble and knew that his window was closing. He could not reach Sansa. The crossbowmen were finding range. The Kingsguard was advancing despite the fire. Winterflame was turning, responding to the attacks with the instinctive aggression of a young dragon that had never been shot at, and whose response to injury was blind, directionless rage. If Jon went for Sansa, the dragon might lose control, and dragonfire in a packed city was not a rescue, it was a catastrophe. Sansa. Jon shouted. His sister's eyes found him, blue meeting grey across 40 feet of cracked marble and dispersing smoke. I'll come back for you. Do you hear me? I will come back. Sansa's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Or if it did, the sound was lost in the dragons screaming, and the crossbows snapping, and the general chaos of a city that was experiencing its first dragon attack in 150 years. Jon turned. He lifted Ned. The older man was leaning on him, barely conscious, the adrenaline of the rescue fading into the crash of malnutrition and exhaustion. And he dragged his father to the dragon, and he pushed him up onto Winterflame's back, and he climbed after, and the mounting was desperate and ugly and nothing like the stories that the maesters told about dragonriders ascending with grace and authority. Winterflame rose. The ascent was violent, the dragon's wings driving down with a force that sent a shockwave across the square, flattening the abandoned market stalls and snuffing every torch on the set's facade. Jon held Ned against the dragon's neck, one arm around his father's chest, the other gripping the scale ridge, his muscles burning with the effort of holding a full-grown man on the back of a creature that was never designed to carry 2 riders and whose flight dynamics were being compromised by the additional weight. A scorpion bolt passed 10 feet to the right. The city's defenses, ancient, unmanned since the last dragon died, but hastily loaded and aimed by soldiers who were improvising a response to a threat they had never trained for, were engaging. The bolt was poorly aimed. Scorpion crews needed time to calibrate, and time was the one thing Jon was not giving them. But the fact that it was fired at all told Jon that the Lannisters' shock was wearing off, and their competence was reasserting itself. Winterflame climbed. The dragon powered upward through the air column, 500 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500. And at 2,000 feet the city was below them, and the scorpions were below effective range, and the crossbows were toys, and the crisis was over. Jon held his father and breathed. Ned was alive, thin, damaged, disoriented, barely conscious, but alive. The man who had been hours from execution was now 2,000 feet above the city that had condemned him, flying north on the back of a dragon that should not exist, held in place by a son whose existence was a secret that Ned had kept for 14 years, and whose nature, Targaryen, dragon-bonded, reborn, was a secret that Ned did not yet know about, and that would, when revealed, rewrite the story of the lie that had defined both their lives. "Hold on," Jon said. "We're going home." Ned's grip tightened on the dragon's scales. Whether the grip was conscious or reflexive, the body's response to altitude and speed, and the primal terror of flight, Jon could not tell. But the grip held, and the dragon flew, and the towers of King's Landing shrank behind them, and Sansa's face, white, terrified, left behind, burned in Jon's mind with the acute agony of a rescue that was incomplete. He had saved his father. He had left his sister. The success was real, and the failure was real, and both were permanent, and both would have consequences that Jon could not yet calculate, and that the realm could not yet imagine. Below them, King's Landing was burning. Not everywhere, not the inferno that Aerys had dreamed of and that the wildfire beneath the city would someday produce, but in patches, where Winterflame's fire had caught wood and thatch, and the dry summer materials that turned a city into kindling. Smoke rose from the square around the sept in grey columns that were visible from altitude and that would be visible from much farther, and the smoke was a message. The dragons had returned. The world had changed. The old rules were burning with the market stalls. Cersei Lannister watched the dragon disappear into the northern sky and said nothing. The boy king beside her was still screaming. The Kingsguard was still drawing swords against an enemy that was already gone. The small folk were still running, still trampling each other, still dying in the crush that the dragon's arrival had produced, and Sansa Stark was still standing on the platform, gripping the rail, staring at the sky where her bastard brother had appeared on a dragon and rescued her father and promised to return for her and flown away, and the look on her face was not relief or gratitude or even hope. It was the expression of a girl who had just learned that the world contained things that the stories had promised and reality had denied, and who did not know whether the return of the impossible was salvation or the beginning of a new kind of catastrophe. The dragon flew north. The fire burned. The realm, which had spent 150 years believing that the age of dragons was finished, began the long, painful process of learning that it was wrong. The war reshaped. Ned Stark returned to Riverrun on the back of a dragon, unconscious, draped across the scales of a creature that the world had not seen in 150 years, held in place by a son whose name was a lie, and whose blood was a secret that had just become the most important political fact in Westeros. The camp's reaction was chaos. Soldiers who had spent the previous day celebrating the Whispering Wood victory were now confronted with the sight of a dragon descending into the field beyond the castle walls, and the reaction was not rational. It was ancestral, the deep bone terror of a species that remembered, in its collective unconscious, the age when dragons ruled and men survived by hiding. Men scrambled for weapons. Horses broke their lines and stampeded. Archers knocked arrows before their commanders could stop them, and 2 shafts flew before Jon's shout, wordless, commanding. The shout of a dragonrider who felt the arrows as though they were aimed at his own body brought Winterflame's head around, and the dragon's roar silenced the camp the way a thunderclap silenced a conversation. Robb was at the landing site before the dust settled. Grey Wind flanked him, the direwolf's hackles raised, not at the dragon, but at the chaos. The wolf's protective instinct engaging because Robb was in the open, and the camp was in disorder, and the combination was a threat that the wolf's training categorized as dangerous. "Father," Robb said. He was at Winterflame's side, reaching up, his hands finding Ned's limp body and pulling the older man down with a strength that panic and love produced in combination. Ned fell into Robb's arms, unconscious, breathing, alive, and Robb held his father on the churned ground and looked up at Jon, who was still mounted on the dragon. And the expression on Robb's face was a catalogue of everything the moment contained. Relief, awe, terror, gratitude, and the dawning recognition that the war he was fighting had just transformed into something that no one in Westeros, including him, was prepared for. "He's alive," Jon said. "Weak, he needs a maester. And food. And rest." He's been in the black cells for weeks. The dragon is mine. The army can see that. They can see that it answers to me, and that I control it, and that it is not a threat to anyone who is not a threat to us. Spread the word before someone does something stupid with a crossbow." Robb nodded. He carried Ned, with help from Daisy Mormont and a Karstark man-at-arms, who had overcome their fear of the dragon through the more immediate imperative of helping their lord, into the castle, into the chambers that had been prepared for Robb's use, and the maesters descended on Ned with the focused urgency of men whose profession was keeping lords alive, and whose current patient was a lord who had been very close to not being alive. Jon stayed with the dragon. He stood beside Winterfell in the field, while the camp reorganized itself around the impossibility of a dragon in its midst, and he watched the Northern Lords process the revelation with the varying speeds and methods that their personalities dictated. The Great Jon was the first to approach. He walked across the field with the deliberate stride of a man who was afraid and who refused to let the fear alter his gait, and he stopped 20 feet from Winterfell and looked at the dragon with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the stories his grandmother told him were not stories. "That's a dragon," the Great Jon said. "Yes, you flew it to King's Landing. Yes, you rescued Ned Stark from the steps of the Sept of Baelor on the back of a dragon. Yes." The Great Jon stared at Winterfell. Winterfell stared at the Great Jon. The dragon's assessment was brief and dismissive. The Great Jon was large for a human, but irrelevant for a predator whose prey threshold started at livestock. And the Great Jon's assessment was longer, and ended with a sound that was half laugh and half prayer. "Well," the Great Jon said, "I suppose we win the war then." The supposition was premature, but understandable. A dragon, even a young one, even one that was still growing, even one whose wing membrane bore the healing wound of a crossbow bolt that had penetrated the tissue and would take weeks to fully close, changed the fundamental calculus of warfare. Castles that were impregnable to assault became vulnerable to fire. Armies that were superior in numbers became inferior in the air. The entire architecture of Westerosi military doctrine, which was built on walls, shields, heavy cavalry, and the assumption that combat occurred on a two-dimensional surface, was rendered obsolete by a creature that operated in 3 dimensions and whose primary weapon could melt stone. The ravens flew that afternoon. Not from Riverrun, from King's Landing. From every castle within eyeshot of the capital. From every ship in Blackwater Bay, whose crew had seen the dragon rise from the city trailing smoke and fire, and carrying a man who should have died on the steps of the Sept. The ravens carried the news across Westeros with the speed that only trained birds could achieve, and the news was simple and world-altering. The dragons had returned. Tywin Lannister received the news at Harrenhal. The Lord of Casterly Rock, who had already absorbed the blow of Jaime's capture at the Whispering Wood, and whose position in the Riverlands was suddenly precarious, read the Raven Scroll in silence, and then sat in silence for an hour. And silence was not shock or fear, but calculation. The rapid and remorseless computation of a man who excelled at war because he treated war as mathematics rather than heroism. The mathematics were clear. A dragon negated Tywin's advantages, his superior numbers, his gold, his castles, his fleet. A dragon could burn a supply train from altitude. A dragon could destroy a siege line in minutes. A dragon could melt the gates of Casterly Rock. Tywin's military position, which had been dominant before the Whispering Wood, was now untenable if the dragon was deployed against him. But Tywin Lannister did not achieve his position by fighting unwinnable wars. He achieved it by recognizing unwinnable wars and converting them into advantageous pieces. The offer came by Raven 3 days after Jon's return to Riverrun. Robb read it in council, the Northern Lords, the Tully Bannermen, Catelyn, Jon, and Ned, who had been revived sufficiently by food and Maester's care to sit upright in a chair and participate in the discussions that would determine the future of his family and his kingdom. Tywin proposes a settlement, Robb said. He offers to release Sansa in exchange for Jaime. He offers to withdraw Lannister forces from the Riverlands. He offers to recognize the North's grievances and to address them through negotiation rather than war. He offers to acknowledge that Ned's arrest was, Robb paused, his lip curling, an overreach by the crown, conducted without proper authority. He offers nothing about Joffrey's legitimacy, Jon said. No, he doesn't mention it. Because mentioning it concedes the point. And if Joffrey is illegitimate, Stannis is king, and Tywin loses everything. Lord Karstark spoke. We have a dragon. We don't need Tywin's offers. We march south, burn his army, take the capital, and put whoever we want on the throne. And kill how many thousands of people in the process? Jon asked. The dragon is a weapon. Weapons are most powerful when they don't need to be used. Tywin is offering terms because the threat of the dragon forces him to negotiate. If we use the dragon offensively, if we burn armies and cities, we become the thing that the realm fears rather than the thing that the realm respects. Since when does a bastard lecture lords on war? Bolton's voice came from the back of the council, dry and measured, the voice of a man who had processed the dragon's existence and filed it under threat rather than advantage. A boy with a pet monster does not make a strategist. A man who lost a third of his infantry at the Green Fork while preserving his own forces does not make a loyal bannerman. Jon replied. The words were quiet and precise and landed in the council like a stone in still water. Bolton said nothing. The silence was dangerous. The silence of a man who had been accused of something true and who was calculating the implications of the accusation. But the danger was blunted by the dragon sitting in the field outside the castle, whose existence made Bolton's options considerably narrower than they would otherwise be. We accept the exchange, Ned said. His voice was a rasp, damaged by weeks in the black cells, by dehydration, by the calculated violence that the Lannisters inflicted on prisoners whose cooperation they wanted, but whose comfort they did not require. But the voice carried authority, because Ned Stark's authority was not built on volume, but on the moral weight that 30 years of consistent honor had accumulated. Shaime for Sansa, the Lannister withdrawal from the Riverlands, and one additional term, safe conduct for our family and our forces to return north without harassment. Nothing about the throne, Robb asked. The throne is not ours to claim or dispose. Joffrey's legitimacy, Stannis' claim, the future of the Iron Throne, those are questions for the great lords of the realm to settle among themselves. We are Starks. We protect the north. We bring our family home. We do not play the game that killed the last men who played it. The exchange was conducted at a neutral site, the Crossroads Inn at the junction of the King's Road and the River Road, a place that was neither Stark territory nor Lannister territory, and whose symbolic neutrality was reinforced by the practical reality that neither side wanted to fight with Jaime Lannister and Sansa Stark in the crossfire. Jon flew overhead. Not as a threat, as a presence, a reminder, the physical manifestation of the power that had made the negotiation possible. Winterflame circled at 1,000 feet, and the shadow that passed over the crossroads at regular intervals was a shadow that kept both sides honest. Sansa emerged from the Lannister escort surrounded by guardsmen, who were not guarding her so much as containing her. A girl of 11 whose face showed the damage that weeks of captivity had inflicted, and whose eyes found Ned and Robb and Catelyn with a desperation that had been suppressed by Lannister custody and was now erupting with the force of everything she had been forbidden to feel. She ran to her father. The reunion was not graceful. Sansa stumbling, Ned catching her, the collision of a father and daughter who had been separated by politics and violence, and the machinery of a court that treated children as currency. Catelyn joined them, and Robb and the family closed around Sansa with the protective instinct of wolves around a wounded pup. Jon stayed apart. He stayed on the dragon, the bastard who had rescued the father, whose existence was the reason the exchange was possible, whose nature was the question that no one had yet asked and that everyone was already answering in whispers. Jaime Lannister was brought forward. The Kingslayer's hands were bound in front of him, not chains, rope. The concession to a prisoner of war whose family was too powerful to humiliate beyond necessity. He walked with the affected nonchalance of a man who refused to appear diminished by captivity, his golden hair catching the sun, his eyes finding Jon on the dragon and holding with an expression that was not fear, but recognition. So that's what carried off Ned Stark, Shaime said. A dragon ridden by a bastard. The gods have a sense of humor after all. Walk, his escort said, and Jaime walked. and the exchange was complete. Ned told the truth in the Godswood at Riverrun, not the Riverrun Godswood. Riverrun's Godswood was a garden, a manicured space of elm and redwood that the southern lords maintained as a gesture toward the old gods without the conviction that the northern lords invested in theirs. But it had a heart tree, a weirwood, ancient and pale, its face carved with the same eyeless expression that adorned every heart tree in every godswood, in every castle where the old gods were remembered. Jon had asked. The asking was necessary. The truth had been implicit since the dragon hatched, since the scales responded to Jon's touch, and the fire did not burn his skin, and the creature that had been extinct for 150 years chose a Stark bastard as its rider. The truth had been implicit, and Jon had stated it to Robb, and the stating had been speculation built on fragments and inference. But speculation was not confirmation, and the confirmation required the man who had created the lie. "You are not my son." Ned said it with the exhaustion of a man who had carried a weight for 14 years and whose arms were finally failing. He sat beneath the weirwood, his body still recovering, his face still gaunt, his voice still the rasp that the black cells had given him. And he spoke the words that unmade the identity he had built for Jon, and that revealed the identity he had hidden. "Lyanna was your mother. Rhaegar Targaryen was your father. You were born in a tower in the mountains of Dorne, in a room that smelled of blood and roses, and Lyanna died bringing you into the world. She made me promise to protect you, to keep you safe, to hide you from Robert, who would have killed you because you were Rhaegar's son, and Robert's hatred for Rhaegar was the kind of hatred that extended to children and would have extended to you." Jon listened. The words were not new. He had assembled most of the truth from fragments of his previous life, from Aemon's teachings and his own deductions, and the visions that Bran would never show him in this timeline. But hearing Ned speak them, hearing the man he had called father confirm the lie that had defined both their lives, was different from knowing. Knowledge was intellectual. Confirmation was visceral. "I took you north," Ned continued. "I claimed you as my bastard. I told everyone, Robert, Catelyn, the household, the realm, that you were my natural son, born of some woman during the war. I let Catelyn hate you because Catelyn's hatred was the price of your survival. If she knew the truth, if she treated you as something other than a bastard, people would ask questions. Robert would ask questions, and Robert's questions about a boy who resembled Lyanna more than Ned would have ended with your death. You let her hate me to protect me. I let her hate you to keep you alive. And the keeping was a betrayal of her, and a betrayal of you, and a betrayal of the marriage, and the trust that marriage required. And I have carried the weight of that betrayal for 14 years. And I would carry it for 14 more if it meant you survived." Jon looked at the heart tree. The carved face looked back, eyeless, expressionless. The face of a god who heard confessions and rendered no judgment and offered no comfort. The gods were silent witnesses. The truth was its own noise. "My name," Jon said. "My real name. Aegon. Lyanna named you Aegon Targaryen. She whispered it with her last breath. She wanted you to have a king's name because you were a king's son, and the weight of that name was a weight she placed on a baby who could not bear it, and on a man who could not speak it. Aegon. The name of the conqueror, the name of the king, who had united the 7 kingdoms with dragonfire and will, and the vision of a single realm ruled by a single throne. The name that Lyanna had chosen in a tower of blood, naming her son for the dynasty that had destroyed itself, and that was now, in a godswood in the Riverlands, being reborn in a boy with a direwolf and a dragon, and a borrowed name. "I am Jon Snow," Jon said. "Jon Snow is who I am. Aegon Targaryen is what I was born. The two are not the same, and I choose the first." Ned looked at him. The grey eyes, identical to Jon's, because the Stark colouring had overridden the Targaryen in Jon's case. The dark hair and grey eyes that made him look like Ned's son even though he was Ned's nephew, held an emotion that was not surprise. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who had spent 14 years wondering how Jon would respond to the truth, and who was now hearing the response and finding it to be the response he had hoped for. "You are a Stark," Ned said. "Whatever else you are a Stark. Your mother was a Stark. Your blood is half wolf. And the wolf in you, the wolf that bonds with Ghost, the wolf that protects its pack, the wolf that fights for family, that wolf is as real as the dragon. I know. Others won't see it that way. The realm will see a Targaryen on a dragon. They will see a claimant to the Iron Throne. They will see a threat. Let them see what they see. I am not a claimant. I do not want the throne. I want the family alive, and the North safe, and the thing that is coming from beyond the wall stopped before it reaches the realms of men." Ned frowned. "Beyond the wall? There is a war coming, Father. Not this war. Not the war of kings and thrones and who sits on a chair in King's Landing. A real war. Against an enemy that doesn't care about politics or borders or the names that men call themselves. I can't explain how I know. Not yet. But the dragon, Winterflame, is not for Tywin Lannister or Stannis Baratheon or anyone who sits in a castle south of the Neck. The dragon is for the North. For the wall. For the war that matters." Ned studied his nephew's face. The face was 14 years old. The eyes in it were not. "You speak like a man who has seen things that a boy of 14 should not have seen. I speak like a man who has lived things that a boy of 14 should not have lived. And I am asking you to trust me. The way Lyanna asked you to trust her. The way you trusted her, and carried the lie, and bore the cost." Ned was silent. The weirwood rustled. Somewhere beyond the Godswood walls, the army was celebrating the peace that Tywin's capitulation had purchased. And the celebration was premature, because peace was a temporary condition, and the forces that produced war were not resolved by a single negotiation. But the celebration existed, and its sound, laughter, singing, the clinking of cups, drifted over the Godswood wall and provided the counterpoint to the conversation within. "I trust you," Ned said. Catelyn was at the Godswood entrance. She had not intended to eavesdrop. She had come looking for Ned, the recovered lord, who was still fragile, still requiring monitoring, still unsteady enough that his wife's watchfulness was medical as much as marital. She had come through the garden and had heard voices, and had stopped at the archway, because the voices were Ned's and Jon's, and the tone was the tone that conversations about secrets carried, and Catelyn Stark had spent 14 years knowing that a secret existed between her husband and his bastard, and had never been permitted to know what it was. She heard everything. The tower, Lyanna, Rhaegar, the promise. The lie. She heard that Jon was not Ned's son. That the betrayal she had resented for 14 years, the infidelity that she had incorporated into her identity as the wronged wife, the wound that she had nursed and tended and used as the foundation for her hostility toward an innocent child, had never happened. Ned had never been unfaithful. There was no betrayal. There was only a sister dying in a tower, and a brother keeping a promise, and a baby growing up under the hatred of a woman who punished him for a sin that no one had committed. Catelyn walked into the Godswood. Her face was composed, the Tully discipline, the training of a woman raised in Riverrun, where composure was a virtue and emotional display was a weakness, but the composition was thin. A surface stretched over depths that were shifting. 14 years, she said. 14 years, Ned. You let me believe I had to. You had to let me hate a child? You had to let me treat him the way I treated him, knowing that he was your sister's son? Knowing that every cold look, every dismissal, every time I reminded him that he was not welcome. You let me do that knowing he had done nothing wrong? If you had known, you would have treated him differently. And if you treated him differently, people would have asked why. People. Which people? Robert? Robert? Who was your friend? Who trusted you? Who would have, what? Asked questions, and from that you decided that a child should grow up without his mother's love, and that his mother's replacement should despise him? Robert would have killed him, Cat. You know Robert. You know what Robert became after Lyanna died. He killed Targaryen children. He endorsed the murder of Rhaegar's other children. Elijah's children, infants wrapped in Lannister cloaks and presented to him as proof of loyalty, he would have killed Jon. And the only protection was the lie, and the lie required your hatred, and I chose Jon's life over your peace of mind, and I would make that choice again. Catelyn stood in the godswood and absorbed the words. The absorption was not passive, it was active, violent, the internal process of a woman dismantling a structure that she had built over 14 years, and discovering that the structure was built on a foundation that did not exist. The hatred she had felt for Jon, the hatred that she had justified, maintained, and defended against her own better instincts, was revealed as misdirected. The betrayal she had endured was revealed as loyalty. The bastard was revealed as a nephew, and the nephew's suffering was revealed as the cost of a promise, and the cost had been paid in a currency that Catelyn herself had minted without knowing it. She looked at Jon, the boy, the young man, the dragonrider, the half-Targaryen who had rescued her husband from execution and who had grown up in her house under her contempt, looked back. And the look he gave her was not accusation or anger or the vindication of a person who had been wronged and was now watching his wronger confront the truth. The look was something older and sadder, the look of a man who had lived two lives and who had learned, in both of them, that the people who hurt you were usually people who were also being hurt, and that the chain of injury extended backward through the years and the lies and the promises that good men made for good reasons that produced bad consequences. "I don't need your apology," Jon said. "I never needed it. What I need is for you to understand that I am not your enemy. I never was. And the war that is coming, the real war, the one that none of us are prepared for, requires a family that is whole, not broken, not divided by lies and resentments that were built on a fiction." Whole, Catelyn's composure broke. The breaking was small, a tremor in the lower lip, a brightness in the eyes, the preliminary signals of tears that a Tully would resist and that a mother might not, and the breaking was private, witnessed only by Ned and Jon and the weirwood tree that heard everything and said nothing. "I am sorry," she said. The words were raw, unadorned, stripped of the rhetorical discipline that Catelyn applied to every other statement she made. "I am sorry for 14 years of cruelty that you did not deserve." "I know," Jon said, "and I forgive you. Because the lie was not your fault, and the cruelty was the lie's consequence, and blaming you for a consequence that originated in a promise made in a tower before you were married would make me the kind of man who assigns guilt to the wrong person, and I have no interest in being that man." The godswood held them, the three of them, the man who had lied, the woman who had hated, and the boy who had forgiven, and the weirwood watched, with its carved eyes that saw everything, and its carved mouth that said nothing, and the moment was private and enormous, and it changed nothing about the world, and everything about the family. The realm that remains. Some duppers. The war did not end. Wars never ended. They subsided. They transformed. They shifted from iron to parchment and from battlefields to council chambers. But the underlying forces that produced them continued to operate beneath the surface of every peace agreement and every handshake and every raven that carried words like truce and terms and resolution. But the fighting ended. Tywin withdrew to the Westerlands. The Lord of Casterly Rock was many things: ruthless, brilliant, patient, merciless. But he was not stupid, and fighting a war against a dragonrider was the act of a stupid man. Tywin's genius was strategic. He recognized that the dragon changed the military equation permanently, that no castle wall and no army could defeat a creature that operated above both, and that the only rational response was withdrawal, consolidation, and the long game of political maneuvering that allowed superior resources to outlast superior weapons. Stannis Baratheon claimed the Iron Throne from Dragonstone. His claim was legitimate. Robert's brothers were the true heirs if Joffrey was indeed James' bastard. But the claim was complicated by the existence of a Targaryen dragonrider in the north whose bloodline predated the Baratheons and whose weapon predated the Iron Throne itself. Stannis' claim rested on Robert's conquest. Jon's claim, if he chose to make it, rested on something older. Jon did not make it. He did not want the throne. The Iron Throne was a chair made of swords, built by conquest, maintained by violence, and coveted by men whose ambition exceeded their capacity for governance. Jon had seen what the throne did to people. He had watched, across 2 lifetimes, as the throne consumed everyone who approached it. Robert, who had died fat and unhappy. Joffrey, who had been crowned and corrupted. Cersei, whose proximity to the throne had turned intelligence into paranoia. The throne was not a prize. It was a trap dressed in gold, and Jon had no intention of stepping into it. "The North does not claim the Iron Throne," Ned wrote to Stannis. The letter was drafted by Maester Vyman and approved by Ned and reviewed by Jon and sent by Raven to Dragonstone with the formal language that political correspondence required. House Stark acknowledges Lord Stannis Baratheon's claim to the throne of the Seven Kingdoms and pledges the North's recognition of that claim. In exchange, House Stark requests the recognition of the North's autonomy in matters of internal governance, military affairs, and succession, and requests that the relationship between the North and the Iron Throne be one of alliance rather than subordination. The letter was a declaration of semi-independence wrapped in the language of loyalty. The North would recognize Stannis as king. The North would not kneel. The difference between recognition and submission was the dragon. Winterflame's existence made the North a power that could not be subordinated without a war that no one could win, and the implicit threat of that war was the foundation of the new political order. Stannis accepted. The Lord of Dragonstone was a pragmatist whose rigid adherence to law and duty was tempered by the recognition that law and duty required enforcement, and enforcement required power, and the power of a dragon outweighed the power of a fleet. The North would be an ally, not a subject. The arrangement was unprecedented. No kingdom in the history of the Seven Kingdoms had maintained this degree of autonomy since Aegon's conquest. But the age of precedent had ended when a dragon rose from the steps of the Sept of Baelor. Sansa came home. She rode through the gates of Winterfell in a column of northern cavalry, thin and quiet, and carrying the scars of King's Landing in her eyes rather than on her skin. The Winterfell she returned to was different from the one she had left. The household was war-altered. The yard held training soldiers, and the hot springs beneath the castle held a dragon. But the differences were secondary to the sameness. The walls were the same. The godswood was the same. The family, damaged, reconfigured, carrying truths that had not existed when she left, was the same in the ways that mattered. Arya returned 2 months later, delivered to Winterfell by a traveling party that had found her in the Riverlands, disguised as a boy, armed with a sword called Needle, and accompanied by a group of Night's Watch recruits and a blacksmith's apprentice, who were bewildered by the revelation that the feral child who had been traveling with them was the daughter of the Lord of Winterfell. She walked through the gates and saw Jon and saw the dragon sunning itself on the walls of the inner keep and said, "I knew it would get bigger." Bran had not fallen. The change was small, so small that Jon had almost forgotten it, buried beneath the larger divergences that his rebirth had produced, but its consequences were enormous. Without the fall, Bran walked. Without the fall, there was no assassination attempt. Without the assassination attempt, there was no Valyrian steel dagger and no accusation against Tyrion, and none of the cascading events that had, in Jon's first life, accelerated the conflict between Stark and Lannister. Bran walked through Winterfell's corridors with the energy of a 7-year-old boy who did not know that another version of himself had been broken on the stones below a tower window, and his ignorance was a mercy that Jon guarded with the ferocity of a man who understood exactly what had been prevented and exactly what it had cost to prevent it. Jon had told Bran not to climb. A single instruction, delivered on the morning of Robert's visit, casual enough to sound like brotherly concern rather than prophetic warning. "Don't climb today, promise me." And Bran, who obeyed Jon with the devotion that younger brothers reserved for the siblings who treated them as equals rather than children, had promised. And the promise had held. And the fall had not happened. And the future had fractured along a different line. The Northern Lords adjusted. Some, the Great Jon, the Mormonts, the Mountain Clans, embraced the dragon with the enthusiasm of men who saw military advantage and whose imaginations were occupied by the battles the dragon could win. Others, Bolton, Karstark, some of the smaller houses. viewed the dragon with the suspicion of men who recognized that a weapon could be aimed in any direction and whose loyalty was contingent on the direction being away from them. Bolton was the problem. Roose Bolton had not committed any act of treachery in this timeline. The conditions that had produced the Red Wedding were absent, the marriage pact with the Freys was unmade, and the opportunity for Bolton to ally with the Lannisters had been foreclosed by the dragon's existence. But Jon knew what Bolton was. He knew the man's nature, and the nature was not created by opportunity. The opportunity merely revealed it. Bolton was a traitor in the way that iron was magnetic. The property existed whether the magnet was present or not. "Watch him," Jon told Robb. "Don't accuse him. Don't confront him. Don't give him a reason to act. Just watch him, and keep the Dreadfort from building strength that exceeds what a vassal house should maintain. You're asking me to treat one of my lords as a suspect based on nothing. I'm asking you to be cautious with a man whose family's sigil is a flayed man. The sigil is not decorative, Robb. It is a statement of values." Robb watched. Bolton was contained, not openly, not aggressively, but through the quiet exercise of a lord's authority over a vassal's resources and movements. The watching was ongoing. The containment was sufficient. The months passed. Winterfell settled into the new order, a castle that housed a dragon, a family that housed a secret, a kingdom that occupied a position in the political geography of Westeros that was unprecedented and unstable and powerful. Stannis took King's Landing. Joffrey and Cersei fled to Casterly Rock. Tywin negotiated, calculated, and waited for the advantage that patience might produce. The realm reshuffled, alliances forming, breaking, reforming, the perpetual motion of political machinery that never stopped and that a dragon's existence had accelerated rather than resolved. Jon trained. He flew Winterflame daily, learning the dragon's capabilities, its limitations, the boundaries of its endurance and speed, and the range of its fire. The dragon grew. By the end of the year, Winterflame was 60 feet from snout to tail, its wingspan approaching 80, its fire capable of melting castle gates at 100 yards. The creature was no longer a young dragon. It was a weapon, a force, a thing that the realm had to account for in every calculation and every plan and every quiet conversation between lords who were deciding which side of which conflict to stand on. But Jon did not train for the south. He trained for the north. He flew to the wall, not to join the Night's Watch, not to take the black, but to see, to stand on the ice and look north and feel the cold that was not weather but presence, the cold that meant the dead were stirring, and the Night King was moving, and the war that Jon had been reborn to fight was approaching with the patience of winter and the inevitability of dawn. He landed Winterflame on top of the wall. The Night's Watch, undermanned, underfunded, forgotten by a realm that did not believe in the threats they guarded against, stared at the dragon with the expression of men who had spent years shouting about dangers that no one believed in, and who were now confronted with a danger that everyone could see. The Lord Commander, old, grey, a man whose name Jon knew from his previous life and whose face had not changed across the timelines, approached Jon with the careful deference of a man addressing a dragonrider who was also, technically, a teenager. "Lord Snow," the Lord Commander said, because the North had not settled on a title for Jon, and Lord Snow was the designation that had emerged from the absence of a better one. "The Wall welcomes you. The Wall needs me," Jon said. "Not today, but soon. There is something beyond the Wall that is worse than wildlings, worse than giants, worse than anything the Night's Watch has faced since the long night. And when it comes, the dragon will be here." The Lord Commander looked at the dragon. The dragon looked north. The red eyes stared into the white expanse beyond the wall, the frozen forest, the endless ice, the territory where the dead walked and the cold was alive, and the enemy that Jon had been reborn to face was gathering its strength for a confrontation that would make the wars of kings look like the squabbles of children. "How do you know?" the Lord Commander asked. Jon did not answer. Some knowledge could not be explained. Some knowledge could only be carried, And the carrying was the burden and the purpose and the reason that a boy had died at Castle Black and woken in Winterfell and found a dragon's egg in his mother's tomb and hatched a fire in the north that would burn against the cold when the cold came for everything. He flew south, back to Winterfell, back to the family he had saved and the home he had reclaimed, and the life that was different from the one he remembered and better in every way that mattered, and fragile in every way that time and politics and the fundamental unpredictability of human nature could make it. Ghost was waiting in the yard, the white direwolf, enormous now, larger than any wolf that had ever lived, red-eyed and silent and bonded to Jon with a connection that was deeper than pet and master, deeper than warg and wolf. The connection of two halves of a thing that functioned best when whole, raised his head as Winterflame descended and watched the dragon land with the calm acceptance of an animal who understood that the sky belonged to his partner's other half. Jon dismounted. He stood in the yard of Winterfell, the castle that had been his home in 2 lives, the castle where he had been a bastard and a prince and a secret and a son, and he looked at the sky that was grey with northern clouds, and he looked at the ground that was hard with northern frost, and he looked at the wall, invisible beyond the horizon, but present in his mind the way a heartbeat was present in the body, constant and essential, and the thing that kept everything else alive. He had been given a second life. He had used it to save his father, to reunite his family, to hatch a dragon, and to forge a peace that was imperfect and temporary and better than the war it replaced. The road ahead was not clear. The dead were coming, the politics were shifting, the dragon was growing, and the question of who Jon Snow was, Stark, Targaryen, bastard, prince, dragonrider, brother, son, was a question that did not have a single answer and did not need one. He was all of those things. He was none of them completely. He was a man who had died and lived again, and who intended to spend his second life ensuring that the people he loved survived the winter that was coming. Ghost pressed against his leg. Winterflame settled on the walls, wings folded, smoke curling from nostrils that glowed with the banked fire that was always present, always ready. The fire of a dragon who had been born in the north, and who would fight for the north when the darkness came. Jon scratched Ghost behind the ear and walked inside, into the warmth of Winterfell, where his family was waiting, and where dinner was being served, and where the things that mattered, food and fire, and the voices of people who loved each other, filled the hall with the sound of a house that was, against all odds and across all timelines, still standing. The winter was coming. But the fire was here,